Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are today in the world. My name is Kinealy. I'm Director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University, and I'm delighted to be opening the address of the very important conference dedicated to James Hack Tuke, Making Connections. To me, James Hack Tuke is a very important, if somewhat forgotten figure in both British and Irish history. I first came across him when I was doing research many years ago on my first publication about the Great Famine, the Great Hunger. And I was really impressed by this young man. He was aged 26, 27, who was a Quaker from the northeast of England, and who travelled to the western tip of Ireland to give relief to the starving poor. And this young man came back again and again. What he witnessed, he never forgot. And even when he returned to his home in Yorkshire, he remembered the Irish by opening a hospital for immigrants to the area. At that stage, he caught what was called famine fever or Irish fever, and something that actually affected his health for the rest of his life. We know from the incredible research of Dr. Gerard Moran that, in fact, James Hack Tuke did come back to Ireland, this time during the forgotten famine of 1879 to 1882. And he knew that in the immediate short term, he had to help people leave Ireland. And so with his Tuke Fund, he set up a remarkable and a successful emigration scheme. Throughout North America now, there are thousands of Tuke descendants, and we're delighted to welcome them. From Carner to Cleveland, from Mayo to Minnesota, you are all very, very welcome. The last 18 months, we have lived through a pandemic, and it's thrown up some heroes, particularly frontline workers. And in a very real sense, James Hack Tuke was a pioneering frontline worker and a famine hero. So it only seems appropriate that today in Making Connections, you should remember him. I hope the day is wonderful. I know anything organised by Maureen Mannion is always wonderful. So enjoy the day, and I wish I could be with you. Thank you.
In 1841, the British philosopher Thomas Carlyle stated that, and I quote, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." What Carlyle was referring to was the British individuals who had helped expand and protect the British Empire. But it failed to take into account those who worked towards the betterment of those people who lived in the empire. Even the history of 19th century Ireland has largely been dominated by prominent political and military figures such as Daniel O'Connell, Charles Stewart Parnell, and James Stephens. Our major events, such as the Great Famine of 1845 to 52 and the Land War of 1879 to 82. But it has failed to highlight the contribution of philanthropists and youth charities who helped to improve the lives of people through their benevolence and charity. One such individual, who up to recently was only a footnote in Irish historiography, was the English Quaker James Hack Tuke, despite the fact that he was described in 1883 as Ireland's greatest benefactor. Tuke's failure to secure recognition and the limelight is not surprising, because he largely pursued his activities outside of the limelight and he shunned publicity. Nevertheless, his endeavours can be divided into three main categories. Firstly, his involvement in charity work and relief during the Great Famine of when he was in Ireland between 1846 and 1847. Again, during the famine of 1880. Also during the crisis in the west of Ireland of 1885 to 86, and again in Donegal in 1889. The second area of his contribution to the poor in Ireland was his assisted emigration scheme between 1882 and 1884. And the aim was to improve the lives of those who were sent to North America, but also those who remained in Mayo and Connemara. And finally, his charitable work can be seen through his engagement and his contribution to the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891. Tuke's Quaker background in York indicated the family's charitable activities, from the establishment of education facilities to the introduction of the first lunatic asylum in Britain. And James's brother Daniel became one of the leading psychiatric physicians in the country. At the age of 26, James came to Ireland with his friend William E. Foster as part of the Quaker relief response to the Great Hunger. And he visited Donegal and Connacht to provide first-hand accounts of the levels of poverty, death, and starvation that he witnessed. The result was him producing a pamphlet, A Visit to Connacht in 1847, in which he attacked the government and local landlords for their failure to provide assistance and to intervene for the starving Irish. Much of his time was spent in Erris, where he highlighted the extreme poverty and deprivation that he encountered. Tuke was to adopt this approach of writing and highlighting what he witnessed on his tours of Ireland in the subsequent famines that he reported on. Writing the pamphlet, A Visit to Donegal and Connacht during the spring of 1880, and report on the distribution of seed potatoes in Achill and the west of Ireland in 1886, with suggestions for permanent relief. What was important about these pamphlets was that they were uncensored and they were not edited. And in each case, he was reporting from those areas which he had visited during the Great Famine. And he concluded over the 50 years that no major improvement had occurred in relation to the improvement of the people. What he witnessed and wrote often brought him into conflict with local authorities and also national groups. In the 1847 pamphlet, he condemned the actions of Sir Roger O'Donnell, the largest landowner on Achill Island, and who was cooperating with the Quakers in the development of the linen industry in the Newport area. But large numbers of tenants had been evicted from the estate at Keele. But the land had been leased to the Achill Church Mission Society, who had carried out the evictions. But O'Donnell was condemned for not helping the dispossessed tenants who were unable to travel to the nearest workhouse at Westport, which happened to be 40 miles away. Tuke also highlighted the inhumanity of John Walsh, who evicted tenants from his property in the Mullet without providing any relief or sanctuary. These statements from a person so young were nevertheless highlighted in the House of Commons by people like Sir George Grey and other parliamentarians during a debate on the Irish famine in 1848. This approach was also pursued in his subsequent tours to areas affected by famine, providing first-hand accounts of what he witnessed, often accompanied by local clergymen or poor law officials who provided him with background information. His description of the landscape that he witnessed and the problems that the people had in surviving left his audience in no doubt how difficult their lives were. An example of this is from Camus in Connemara in 1880, in which he wrote, "I wish I could produce that rocky coast with miserable village, so that English people might realize how in these remote places so many thousands of people are living. I will venture to say no one would think it possible that any human being could live or even find a foothold on this rock-strewn shore. Several families were sitting around small quantities of the smallest old potatoes I've ever seen, and with nothing else to eat but them. Again in 1885, when he distributed relief in Mayo and Galway after the failure of the potato crop, he provides a graphic account of conditions under which the people lived, reporting from Lettermullen, a quote, "The poverty is unspeakable, and what misery and suffering are borne, which can never be revealed until some stranger comes poking into those out of the way areas." From his first visit to Ireland, Tuke showed an empathy and compassion for the poor of the west of Ireland. During his tour in 1847, he dismissed the official government argument that the Irish were lazy and famine was the result of their refusal to work hard and utilize the resources they had been given. He was just after returning from a tour of the United States, and he stated that he had witnessed Irish immigrants who worked hard and under the right conditions were able to live comfortably. He also highlighted the strong community bonds that existed amongst the Irish, who were prepared to send remittances back to their friends and relations in Ireland. And he also wrote that he witnessed families in Ireland who had virtually nothing, prepared to share the little they had with neighbours who had nothing to eat. What he was doing was he was dispelling the myth in official government circles that the Irish were selfish and not prepared to help each other. Throughout his life, Tuke was prepared to counteract the preconceived English attitudes about the Irish. When he was asked at a parliamentary select committee meeting in 1882 why he was engaged with Irish paupers through his assisted immigration scheme in Connemara, he replied that they were not paupers, but the poor who existed in very poor circumstances. These sentiments are evident throughout his correspondence to his daughters, in which he refused to talk about the Irish in derogatory terms. While Tuke was critical of the government's response and involvement in the Great Famine and the Forgotten Famine, he realized by early 1880 there would never be any material improvement in the lives of the people of the west of Ireland without direct government intervention. Using his political and business contacts, he was able to secure government funding for his assisted immigration scheme in 1883 and 1884, but which was also extended to other poor law unions along the western seaboard, which were not administered by the Tuke Committee. He was prepared to advise and work with all Irish chief secretaries in the 1880s and 1890s, from W.E. Foster up to Arthur Balfour, to advance the condition of the people of the West. It was the Chief Secretary, John Morley, who asked Tuke to distribute relief in Mayo and Connemara in 1885. And again in 1889, he went to Donegal at the behest of the then Chief Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to report on conditions in the county after the potato had failed and what remedial measures needed to be put in place. By this stage, Tuke was also convinced that the region needed an economic stimulus to counteract the perennial subsistence and famine crises, and thus, and this could only be achieved through direct government intervention. He was already in direct contact with Arthur Balfour as to how this could be achieved, paying a number of visits to the Chief Secretary's residence in the Phoenix Park. His correspondence indicates a certain frustration as to progress of these talks and the failure to put in place sustainable economic solutions. When the Congested District Board was established in 1891, Tuke was not entirely happy with its provisions, but nevertheless, the board saw the board as a building block in the advancement of the Western region. While Arthur Balfour has been given the credit for the formation of the Congested Districts Board, there is little doubt but that Tuke was the inspiration and the guiding force in its formation. The economic advancement of the West under the board would not have taken place, but for the persistence that with government politicians, and his role can be noted in that he was the only non-Irish commissioner appointed to the board when it was established. Even before the Congested Districts Board came into being, Tuke showed a pragmatism about the conditions of the West that was lacking in many other agencies and in government officials. This can be seen through his assisted emigration scheme between 1882 and 1884, which resulted in 1,300 families, a total of 9,500 people from Mayo and Galway, having their passage paid to a new life in North America. The proposals in 1882 were not radical, because such schemes were already in place from the early 19th century, starting with the Peter Robinson scheme from the Blackwater region of North Munster to Peterborough, Ontario between 1823 and 1825. And of course, you had the notorious and controversial landlord schemes during the Great Hunger. Even during the forgotten famine of 1879 to 82, assisted immigration schemes were taking place, such as that of the Nugent scheme from Connemara to Graceville, Minnesota in 1880. When the Tuke scheme differed was that they were very well planned and coordinated. And unlike other schemes, they were not a knee-jerk reaction to the impending failure of the potato. After touring the west of Ireland in the spring of 1880 and realizing the people continued in abject poverty, Tuke visited the United States and Canada, holding meetings with individuals such as the Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, President Hayes of the United States, and Bishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Minnesota, to ascertain where immigrants should be sent, to where there were employment opportunities, and where their support was available. The Tuke immigration scheme differed from the other schemes in that the immigrants were sent to 218 different locations in North America, thus ensuring there was very little local opposition to the new arrivals. The main locations for the immigrants were in Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Ontario. Tuke had a preference to send the immigrants to Canada, where the government was prepared to provide assistance from their arrival in Quebec, and those sent to the United States. But they had to provide evidence that friends and relations would look after them upon their arrival. He also ensured that he had the support of local groups, both within Ireland and North America, which would ensure the success of the scheme. Prior to the establishment of the Tuke Committee in 1882, Tuke held meetings with Fair Foster, Father Nugent, and John Sweetman, all who were involved in assisted immigration schemes at this time. This helped him to work out the logistics and practicalities for the proposed schemes and to avoid any pitfalls. In Mayo and Connemara, Tuke was assisted by local clergymen, members, local officials from the poor law unions, and medical doctors, selecting the most suitable applicants to be sent. Only families rather than individuals were to be assisted. And each family had to have an adequate number of breadwinners who would support the rest of the family. One of the reasons for sending off families was Tuke envisaged that the holdings that were being vacated would then be redistributed amongst the remaining families, creating viable farms. In North America, Tuke worked with clergymen in the dispersal of the immigrants, who ensured that only 2 families were sent to each location on each boat. In Richmond, Indiana, the Gaughan and Ducey families from Balmullet were sent to the local pastor, Reverend MacMullen, who looked after them. One of the families from Connemara, who arrived in Peterborough, Ontario, where the local priest agreed to take them in, had a house built for them by the local community and also employment. Many of these who had been involved in the scheme in Peterborough were descendants of the Robinson scheme that had been sent there between 1823 and 1825. Of those sent to Canada in 1883, 650 were sent directly to the care of Catholic clergymen, while another 1,200 were catered for by agents of the Dominion and the Ontario government. Even those sent to Minnesota, the vast majority of them were looked after by local priests at the behest of Bishop John Ireland. The success of the scheme in 1882, what happened was you had a very large demand the following year when the scheme came into being, as can be seen by between the 300 and 400 people who appeared for interview when Tuke arrived in Carna on the 27th of February 1883. Tuke always felt that immigration had a role to play in overcoming the problems of overcoming poverty in the west of Ireland. He realised that remittances would play a major role in the survival of those who remained in Connemara and Mayo. And he was prepared, and he was sort of quite correct in this assessment. In 1884, it was estimated that between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds had been sent back by those immigrants who had left the Clifden area in 1882, in sums that ranged from £4 to £30. One of these immigrants who worked in a paper mill in Portland in Maine sent £3 home in July 1883. Others that had settled in places like Manchester, New Hampshire, Lynn and Boston were also sending money back. Those who were assisted in 1882 and 1883 largely become agents for immigration, telling their friends and relations back home how well they were doing, urging them to join them in North America. As one immigrant from Cushariga, who had settled in Portland, Maine, told his relatives in Connemara, quote, "I ain't sorry for leaving Ireland, and if I got Feenish Island free forever, I would not go. There ain't a month, but we would have £20 a month." When all of the other immigrants who were based in the Midwest told his friend, a friend in Connemara, how well he would do if he came to what he called the land of freedom, and where you put your hand in your pocket to discover dollars. While the immigration scheme came to an end in 1884, largely due to the opposition of the Catholic Church, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Poor Law Guardians, an improved harvest, and the withdrawal of support by the British government, Tuke still sought for the rest of the 1880s as an integral part of the panacea to the problems of the West. While government financial support was no longer available, still in the second half of the 1880s, Tuke was responsible for personally funding another 500 people from Mayo and Connemara to emigrate to North America. At the same time, many of the immigrants who had been sent out under the schemes were now sending money back so that friends and relations could join them. While the formal immigration scheme came to an end in 1884, Tuke was to use his experiences in the west of Ireland to highlight the ongoing struggle for survival by many individuals. It was during his tour of Connemara and Mayo in 1885 to 1886 that he introduces a process that becomes a bedrock of the congestion board in the 1890s. This where he had previously highlighted the problems of communities. In 1885, 1886, he started highlighting the difficulties which individuals had, such as John Malley of Moran, who paid a rent of £2.04 a year, largely through seasonal migration, but had not been able to pay his rent for the previous 2 years. In 1885, Malley had left for England, but had only brought back £1 from his activities as a seasonal migrant. Later on, under the Congested Districts Board, what they did was, the officials, was they showed the income and expenditure that individual families had, as in the case of one family in Lettermullen, whose total income was £33, but their total expenditure was over £30. So you can see there was very little room for manoeuvre there. Tuke's experiences in Ireland were to change his political affiliations. The Tuke family were largely involved with the Liberal Party. Most of the nonconformists in Britain, they tended to support the Liberals in the 19th century. There was also the fact that one of his best friends was W.E. Foster, a parliamentarian who also became Irish Chief Secretary in 1880. Foster was responsible for Tuke coming to Ireland in February 1880 to report on famine in the west of Ireland. Indeed, Tuke was so well thought of in Liberal circles that he was asked in 1885 to contest the general election for the Liberal Party in the very same Liberal seat of York. In 1886, he turned down the offer of a peerage and a seat in the House of Lords from Earl Spencer. By this stage, his political allegiance had changed, and he was very critical of many of the Irish chief secretaries, including George Trevelyan, who had replaced Frederick Cavendish when he was murdered in the Phoenix Park by the Invincibles in May of 1882. Trevelyan refused to provide relief for the Carna area in 1882 when the potato failed. What does Tuke do? Tuke gives £130 himself so that food could be brought in to feed the most destitute families in Carna. His criticism of the various chief secretaries was largely due to their failure to provide assistance for the poor of the west of Ireland. As with John Morley, because with the crisis of 1885-1886, the Irish Chief Secretary, John Morley, had asked Tuke to go to the west of Ireland and distribute food, not the government itself. By this stage, there was a feeling in some circles that relief money that was poured into the west of Ireland by the government was largely wasted, and it achieved very, very little. He was undoubtedly, Tuke was influenced by what he witnessed during his tour in Connacht in the spring of 1880, when the Land League agitation was taking place. He was very much opposed to the 1886 and 1893 Home Rule bills that William E. Gladstone brought in. He felt that, having looked at the way in which the Poor Law Guardians, who were now dominated by the National League and Parnell, how they operated, that they did not look after the problems of the poor. He also, by 1886, described Parnell as a dictator. But it was largely due to what he saw during the Land League agitation in 1880 that convinced him that the Home Rule would not be a good thing for Ireland. In April of 1880, 1 million people were being fed and kept alive by the private relief organisations. But at the same time, a general election was taking place, and none of the Home Rule candidates put forward any idea in relation to the famine crisis that was taking place. Thus, a factor, as to why he did not see Home Rule as a good thing. He also was aware that the whole issue of the land purchase schemes was not necessarily going to be the solution for poor tenants along the Western Seaboard. In 1886, the Ashburn Land Purchase Act was brought in, which provided money so that tenants could buy out their farms from their landlords. But Tuke himself stated that what you would get should be, and I quote, should we not merely be face to face with 300,000 impoverished owners of land instead of 300,000 impoverished tenants. He felt that the resources would not be able to sustain the population because the holdings were too small for them to be able to survive, and the land was too barren. Perhaps Tuke's greatest contribution to the people of the west of Ireland, and for which he has received little recognition, was his involvement with the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891. From the time that he came to Ireland in 1880, he realised that economic development of the region was essential to counteract the perennial famines and subsistence crisis. Right. Immigration was an immediate issue that would help with the poorest of the poor. But for the long-term economic development of the West, what was actually required was that an economic development plan would have to be put in place. This would ensure that the subsistence crisis and famines would help to be ameliorated. One of the areas that he pushed in particular was the development of an adequate transport system into the poorest areas of the west of Ireland. In 1880, when he had been in Connemara, he had been told of a village in the mountains that there was no road leading to it. Nobody basically knew it existed except for the local parish priest. And the people in the village knew nothing of the outside world. He felt that with an adequate transport system, it would help in the development of tourism, help also with regards to the fishing industry and agriculture. It would also help as well the development of local industries. In fact, up to 1883, there had been a number of suggestions in relation to the establishment of rail links, but this they had never taken place, largely because of government inertia, the refusal to provide finance, and also a lack of capital from within the local communities. With the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891, in the long term, it was to transform the regions that were the poorest parts of the country. You saw the development of fishing, and this was Tuke's responsibility, was to look after and develop the fishing industry by providing funds for the purchase of boats and that of equipment. Also, the opening up of markets, for the fish. And what is absolutely amazing is the amount of time that Tuke spent in 1892 and 1893 visiting places like Baltimore in County Cork, the Aran Islands, Burtonport in Donegal, seeing how the fishing industry could be developed and could be progress in these particular areas. One of the contributions that he has made as well was that he realized that with the coming of the Congested Districts Board and the money that was being provided for economic development, it was going to bring the end of an old a system and a way of life. It was Tuke that was responsible for getting people like Rutledge Fair and Robert Welch to photograph the regions before it disappeared. What has to be remembered is that Tuke was engaged in these activities in the 1880s and 1890s when he was over 60 years of age and when he was not in great health. In 1848, he had contracted famine fever or typhus as a result of helping Irish famine immigrants in York. In York, the authorities had refused to provide the facilities for the influx of these immigrants, but the Tuke family had built a shed where they could be looked after. It was as a result of tending to these immigrants that Tuke contracted the typhus. While he recovered, it did have a debilitating effect on him for the rest of his life. At times, he spoke about a lack of energy, a lack of strength, and not being able to do things. But yet, when you look at the time and energy he put into his activities in the 1880s and 1890s, it just shows his commitment and dedication. When he arrived in Clifden in April of 1882, 6 weeks later, he had arranged for the selection, the sending off, the clothing, the coaches that would bring them into Galway, and the ports, the ships to arrive in Galway, so that they could be sent off to North America. At times, he indicated that it was a burden he found extremely onerous, but nevertheless, it does indicate his commitment, his passion to the poor of the West. While Tuke may not have been recognised nationally for his contribution to the poor of the west of Ireland, there is no doubt that in the communities that he worked at the time, what he was doing for the people was greatly appreciated. While William Gregory, the husband of Lady Gregory, described him as Ireland's greatest benefactor in 1883, it was local leadership who praised him for his endeavours later on, even those who had been in opposition to him, especially over the assisted emigration scheme. According to Reverend Thomas Flannery, the parish priest of Carna, hundreds of families would have died of starvation, but for the relief provided by Tuke. While Reverend Linsky of Clifden told Tuke in 1886 that his parishioners told him how grateful they were to the work of Tuke and would offer him a céad míle fáilte on his next visit to Clifden. There was a story as well that was told by when Tuke attended one of the agricultural fairs which were being promoted by the Congested Districts Board in the 1890s. And when John Foran heard that this was Mr. Tuke, as they used to call him, C-H-U-K-E, he went over to him and he said, "We should have to take our hats off to you for all that you have done in this area over the last number of years." What we actually see with Tuke is somebody whose passion, whose commitment to the poor was never in doubt. But what we also realize is that Tuke was prepared to go to great lengths, both politically and health-wise, in order to help those who he regarded as equals and not as paupers. Okay, thank you.
Growing up in the west of Ireland, I knew nothing about my maternal great-grandparents other than that they went to America and came back a short time later. Then I heard the name of James Hack Tuke, got the manifest with their names on it, and a cousin made contact from America who had been doing research on the family. And suddenly the whole story came rushing up for air. Using these documented facts and my imagination, I wrote the publication Bone Road in Word and Image. And I'm going to read a poem now called Witness. Witness. When he got home to England, he wrote to the papers, Mr. Tuke, merchant banker, Quaker, told them how he had watched a wraith sitting at a loom with neither woof nor warp, shunting the empty frame forward, back, in a place where the poor sucked stones from the road, ate their children's hair, were blown like chaff into the lake's unsated mouth. And more failed years to follow, rain that washed the turf back into the bog, the best of them with nothing but a mouthful of meal. Clutches of begging letters sent to him hidden under the wings of a hen, and seeing what he saw, the only hope of their saving was in the form of a fund that sent the Allen line up and down the coast, netting shoal after desperate shoal.
My name is Rosemary Garrity, and I'm a part-time local history researcher attached to Oughterard Heritage Centre in Ockley and Blacksod, County Mayo. I've lived in Blacksod for over 40 years. My dad was from Achill, and naturally I have great fondness for Blacksod and Achill. I would also have strong family connections with Cleveland, Ohio, and Holyoke, Massachusetts, also Wisconsin. Why did I start this quest, and how did it all come about? The real motivation for the project was seeing an article in the Irish Times dated March 31st, 1883. The following is an extract by an Irish Times reporter who walked with the emigrants. Breakfast was supplied by the committee to the emigrants, and before 6 o'clock, the road, 5 miles in length, extending between Belmullet and Barna, the place of embarkation, was filled with the departing people, formed of old and young. The long procession wended its way seawards, some walking and bending beneath the weight of huge bundles containing the entire property of the family, while others rode slowly forward in carts, the father leading the horse and the mother and children and baggage occupying the vehicle. For hours this scene continued with few intervals. And it goes on to say, in the distance rose the 3 masts and hull of the Nestorian. Near ashore lay the Seahorse, its decks already crowded with men, women and children. Across the blue water of the bay, the rowboats, filled with their living freight, swiftly glided, and upon the sands of the shore stood the remaining emigrants, while all around were visible the lofty, rugged mountains of Mayo, their snow-clad heights glistening in the sunlight. The departing people were the families of our Erris and Achill communities of County Mayo, leaving from Ely Bay, for many their very own doorstep. These scenes were unfolding just a few miles down the road from the Heritage Centre, at a place I would pass on almost a daily basis, yet there was no present-day mention of it. This led to finding out more about James Hack Tuke, which Gerard has covered in great detail already. As a member of the Erris community, I asked myself, what about the families and how did they fare? I wanted to find out more, so the research began. Blacksod Bay Emigration, re-establishing a bond. In the springtime of 1883 and 1884, over 3,300 people, families of Erris, Achill and Newport West, County Mayo, emigrated on 15 sailings directly from Blacksod Bay to the US and Canada. These families, often called Ireland's forgotten emigrants, were part of our community. Where did the departing families leave from? They left from a small corner of northwest Mayo called Erris, which covers 360 square miles, as well as Achill Island and Newport West, also the offshore islands of Inishkea, Inishglora and Inishbiggle. The families were rowed out in small boats from Barna, Ely Bay, an inlet of Blacksod Bay, to the Navy ship, which ran up alongside the ocean steamer, anchored in the deeper waters of the bay. The Achill families arrived at the ship in hookers, towed by a larger vessel. The journey would usually take 12 to 14 days. The ocean steamers were the reputable steamships of the Allen line of Glasgow, not the coffin ships of a former era. The families of Clifden and Oughterard, assisted by the Tuke Fund, joined the ship in Galway. Untitled Heritage Centre, as mentioned, is situated near where the people embarked on the ships. The families were part of our community. I personally found it very moving to think of all the families leaving and nothing to remember them by. We wanted to reach out to their descendants and give them a focal point previously non-existent. It was important to connect descendants with the land of their forebears, to discover and embrace their Irish heritage and culture, and re-establish a bond once again. The research began in 2008. Unfortunately, as a small community-based, not-for-profit centre, we had very few resources. We didn't even have the luxury of the now freely available civil and parish church records. FamilySearch.org was very helpful. We did, however, buy a copy of Mr. Tuke's Fund for Assisted Emigration, which is now also freely available online. The assisted emigration was so well structured and documented by Mr. Tuke's Fund. This report acted like a compass and led the way. Mr. Tuke's Fund. Disposal of holdings for Belmullet, Achill and Newport districts stated heads of households for 1883, although none for 1884. Many general destinations were also stated in the Tuke report, not individual family destinations. Most importantly, the dates of the ships leaving Blacksod were recorded. Blacksod Bay was not an official stop on the Glasgow to Boston or Quebec route. The ships of the Allen line were requested to call at Blacksod by the Tuke Committee. Descendants found it difficult to locate their ancestors' journey from Ireland. An opportunity had arisen through the assisted emigration scheme for a family to all travel together, and many descendants were unaware of this. After much detailed searching, the manifests of the 15 sailings were eventually gathered and transcribed to the best of my ability. This took a huge amount of time, but seeing the words Blacksod Bay written on a manifest made it all worthwhile. Unbelievably and overwhelmingly, here were the families of our community: Barretts, Corleys, Gorhans, Geraghty's, Kilbans, Graylish, just names on a manifest page, but so much more than that. I would have seen posts from the diaspora looking for information on the internet as to where their ancestors came from in County Mayo and not finding any answers. They often wondered how an entire family could afford the passage to all travel together to America or Canada. So with the help of the manifests, Mr. Tuke's Fund and some local knowledge, messages were sent and connections were made with descendants. The feedback from those descendants was just so inspiring, motivating, and very humbling. This was their story waiting to be told. Mr. Tuke's Fund was their family story unfolding. The research continued and we had a small exhibition at the Heritage Centre in 2008. Fast forward to 2013, then came a boost to the research that made such a difference. 2013 was going to be Ireland's official year of the gathering, a year to connect with the diaspora. The Gathering 2013 was a tourism-led initiative in Ireland. It aimed to mobilise the Irish diaspora to return to Ireland during 2013 to be part of specially organised local gatherings and events during the year. Coincidentally, 2013 also marked the 130th anniversary of the first sailings from Blacksod Bay, a great opportunity to connect with our diaspora. On the strength of the research carried out over many years, the management and committee of the Heritage Centre were fortunate to source and receive partial funding towards the building of our specially commissioned Blacksod Bay Immigration website to collate and relay the information gathered in an easy-to-view format to connect with our diaspora. It was important that this website be free to view. This was a way of giving something back. Our aim was to re-establish a bond with as many descendants as possible. Blacksod Bay Immigration website. In June 2013, we launched our main Black Sod Bay Immigration website at an event in the Heritage Centre. Gerard Moran was with us that day. Finally, we had our much needed focal point where descendants could search for their ancestors and add information regarding their families if they wished. Some added a great deal of information, helping other descendants discover their family connections. We also added a latest news descendants WordPress site. The Black Sod Bay Immigration website comprises of names transcribed from copies of the original ship's manifests. These are the names documented on leaving Ireland. With local knowledge, variations of surnames are apparent and can be understood and are added to the website. As mentioned earlier, the Mayo townlands for 1884 were not stated in Mr. Tuke's fund, so they were researched and they continue to be added to the website. As family groups, the records would be more accurate for locating a townland. Because of the funding, we were able to subscribe to Ancestry.com. Messages were sent to descendants on public member trees to help them connect, about 160 messages. Where did the families leave from? Mostly the Midwestern states of the US and Canada, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, Iowa, Rhode Island and Connecticut, also Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Jersey. And what became of them? As there is no surviving complete census of Ireland until 1901, the manifests, in effect, act as a mini census for the families of Eris and Achill at that time in history. The 1885 Minnesota State Census was invaluable, as only 1 or 2 years had passed. The families destined for Minnesota were there. Many families settled in Minnesota. Simon McNeela and Pat Cawley families from Belmullet on board SS Nestorian, mentioned in one of the letters home to the Tuke Committee, were indeed in Lansing, Mower County, Minnesota, working on the railroad. The families emigrated in 1883 and 1884, but with the loss of the 1890 US federal census, the majority were found on the 1900 US census. The Census of Canada records were available. Many of the families traveling to Quebec are seen on the 1900 US census, which shows us that they didn't wait long in Canada and traveled on into the US. When scouring census records, the families had found employment in numerous fields. Many Eris families worked in the anthracite mines of Pennsylvania. A great number were working on the railroads, especially in Minnesota, Montana, and Wisconsin. Groups of families also went to the textile mills in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where work had been secured for them. Employment was also found in the glassworks in Bel Air, Ohio, known as Glass City. Of the families that settled in Wisconsin and Iowa, many appeared to be farming. In Massachusetts, especially Holyoke, families worked in the paper mills. Cleveland, Ohio, saw many Achill families working in the shipyards and iron foundries, where an Achill community was already established. It became apparent from the US Census records that wherever the families settled, there were other local Mayo families who had traveled out many years before. The families established their own communities, keeping traditions and language alive. As a result of the close-knit communities, many local families are laid to rest together in the same cemeteries in the US. The Find a Grave website is a very good resource. We travel back Black Sod Bay, 30th of March, 1883, and the families boarding the first sailing. SS Nestorian, last foot on Irish soil, first step on a life-changing journey, and their descendants are returning. The Nestorian departed Black Sod Bay, 30th of March, 1883, and arrived at Boston the 15th of April, 1883. The families disembarked the next morning due to the late arrival of the ship. William Cawley, Rush County, Indiana, naturalization certificate stated that he emigrated, then disembarked at Ely Bay and arrived at Boston on the 15th day of April, 1883. Here we see William Cawley. The SS Nestorian manifest stated William and Annie Cawley family were ticketed to Rushville, Indiana. The Cawley family were from the Mullet Peninsula, and their descendants have returned. We see here Bridget family, Belmullet to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, also on the Nestorian, and descendants are returning. We see descendants returning from Ohio. Peter and Mary Gaughan family, Shra, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and descendant there is returning from New York. Honor Heveron family, Fallmore to Youngstown, Ohio, descendant returning from Michigan. Pat and Kath McManaman family, Glencastle, Lowell, Massachusetts, and descendants there are returning from Massachusetts and Virginia. And Geraghty family, Drum, Mullet Peninsula, Minnesota, and a descendant is returning from Minnesota. Ned and Bridget Lavelle family, Inver to Columbia County, Pennsylvania, descendant is returning from North Carolina, and another descendant is returning from New York. Anthony and Margaret Barrett family, Shra, Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, and a group of descendants returned from Chicago. We go on to the next sailing now of SS Canadian to Boston, 1883. Thomas and Bridget Donnelly family, Inishbiggle Island to Elroy, Wisconsin, and descendants are returning from Wisconsin, as we see there. SS Scandinavian to Quebec, 1883. Frank and Sarah Toher family from Tipaholosheen to Ontario, Canada, and we see their descendant returning from Toronto, and also another descendant visiting from Toronto. Brian and Margaret McManaman family, Ackle Island, Cleveland, Ohio, also on the Scandinavian, and a descendant there is returning from Ohio. Etis Phoenician, Boston, 1883. John and Kath Toher family from Tipaholosheen to Grosvenor, Connecticut. Descendants family was mentioned in the Tuke Report, 1883, referring to the arrival of SS Phoenician, featured in the Boston Daily Advertiser. And we see descendant returning from Massachusetts. Peter and Honor Murphy family from Curlikeys to Montana were also mentioned in the Tuke Report regarding the Boston Daily Advertiser. The Murphy family were traveling that were referred to as the Montana-bound family that were traveling to Montana, with also other local families. Etis Manitoban to Quebec, 1883. William and Mary Hopkins family, Archie Cunnon, Belmullet to Wolfe Island, Ontario, and descendants returning from Pennsylvania. Etis Prussian to Boston, 1883. Peter and Rose McAndrew family, Glencastle to Baldwin, Wisconsin. Descendant is returning there from Colorado. Etis Canadian to Quebec, 1883. Pat and Mary Lavelle family, Devlon, Mullet Peninsula to Allegheny, Pennsylvania, and descendants are returning from Pennsylvania there, and they're actually in the Heritage Centre, as most of the descendants would come back to the Heritage Centre. Etis Austrian, Anthony and Mary Kennedy family from Cross Mullet Peninsula to Wisconsin, and we see their descendants returning from Minnesota. Also on the Austrian, Etis Austrian, Dennis and Mary Ginley family, Moyrahan to St. Paul, Minnesota, and their descendants are returning from Minnesota. Also on board SS Austrian was Michael and Anna Barrett family from Lame, Mullet Peninsula, going to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this is a beautiful photograph of Michael and Anna and the family. Michael Barrett Jr.'s descendants returning from Colorado. And also Sarah Barrett's descendant returning from Minnesota. And descendants returning from Minnesota and Oregon of Anthony Barrett, who was actually born in Minnesota. The SS Grecian to Quebec, 1883, John and Margaret Tollett family, Talabel-Mullet to Pennsylvania. And as you can see there, Annie was actually born on the voyage, and descendants of John and Margaret returning from Massachusetts. They've been back to visit. SS Buenos Aires to Quebec, 1883, Patrick Sweeney family from Atchewalla, Bangor Eris to Chicago, Illinois. Descendants returning from Virginia and Florida, also descendants from Michigan. SS Waldensian to Boston, 1883, James and Mary Lynch family, Coron Peninsula, Achill to Cleveland, Ohio, descendants returning from North Carolina. And also on board SS Waldensian was Pat and Kath Monaghan family from Layham, Mullet Peninsula to Warren, Rhode Island, descendants returning from Massachusetts there. Also on board SS Waldensian, Philip and Mary Heverin family, Duloch to Warren, Rhode Island. So both families were travelling to Rhode Island and boarded at Blacksod as well. And a descendant there is returning from Washington State. SS Canadian to Boston, 1884. These are the 1884 sailings now. Edward and Bridget Dane family, Ballycroy to Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the descendant is returning from West Virginia. Another family on board SS Canadian was Dominic and Bridget Barrett family, Barhove, Belmullet Peninsula to Delaware, Ohio, and descendants are returning from Washington, D.C. and returning from Arizona. SS Phoenician to Boston, 1884, James and Ellen Cormick Corristine O'Malley family, Duloch to Warren, Rhode Island, and we have a descendant returning from California. SS Korean to Quebec, 1884, Pat and Ann Monaghan family, Ohadoon to Livingston, Montana, and we see their descendants returning from Montana and also from Washington State. And the last sailing, SS Prussian to Boston, 1884, Anthony and Ellen Noon family, Talabel Mullet to Warren, Rhode Island, and we see their descendant returning from Massachusetts. Blacksod Memorial Garden. What initially was going to be a small commemorative plaque at Ely Bay developed into a memorial garden at Blacksod near the lighthouse. Blacksod Memorial Garden and Blacksod Bay Immigration are dedicated to the memory of the families who left these shores in 1883, 1884, assisted by the Tuke Fund. And here we have signage in the memorial garden. Over 200 direct descendants have returned from the United States and Canada to Blacksod Bay. The descendants have connections with over 1,500 passengers, records researched for approximately 2,800 persons, many messages sent to descendants and waiting to hear back. It's a privilege to say that for each of the 15 sailings that left from Blacksod Bay, descendants have physically returned to their ancestral home. As the Achill families also boarded the same sailings at Blacksod, we contacted descendants of those families, many of whom settled in Cleveland. After the launch of the website, we wanted others to know of the assisted emigration and shared this information with well-respected Cleveland historian Margaret Lynch. We wanted to help all descendants. Later in 2013, it was such a privilege when Professor Christine Kinealy visited the Heritage Centre with Dr. Gerard Moran to see the work we had carried out in Ockley and Blacksod. The Mayo Tuke emigrants were part of an even bigger picture. In 2014, we met up with Clifden and Oughterard representatives and discussed remembering the County Galway families also. Descendants are still making contact, some through the main website and Heritage Centre, others replying to ancestry messages. Those who have made contact are relaying the information to others. There are many inquiries on Facebook groups that lead to Blacksod Bay immigration. Descendants were due to travel back in 2020 and 2021. Naturally, because of the pandemic, this didn't happen. It's always such a privilege and humbling to welcome back descendants of the families who made those life-changing journeys in 1883 and 1884 back to their ancestral home. Eamon, a local man, visited the grave of James Hack Tuke in Hitchin, Hertfordshire, England. Thank you, Mr. Tuke. A sentiment expressed by descendants, many of whom had no idea of the assisted emigration scheme or that families travelled together as a community. James Hack Tuke helped the families of Mayo and Galway in 1882, 1884. Through the comprehensive, well-documented and structured Tuke report, he is now helping descendants find their way back. This time, the descendants of those courageous families are on their own voyage of discovery. the springtime of 1883 and 1884, over 3,300 people, families of Erris, Achill and Newport West, County Mayo, emigrated on 15 sailings directly from Blacksod Bay to the US and Canada. Their descendants are once again part of our community, and together we remember them. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Kathleen Villiers-Tuthill. I am a historian and a writer, and I'm delighted to be part of this conference celebrating the connections made arising out of our shared interest in James Hack Tuke and his work in the west of Ireland in the 1880s. The Clifden Tuke Committee was formed in January 2014 following a meeting in Galway County Buildings arranged by Galway County Heritage Officer Marie Mannion. At the meeting we were told by Gerard Moran and Rosemary Garrity of the work being done in Mayo on the immigrants who departed from there under the Tuke immigration scheme. During the meeting it was decided to set up committees in Clifden and Oughterard to do similar work there. Carner became involved in the project a little later. Since then, each committee has worked independently but very closely. Of the 9,500 persons who departed from Galway and Mayo under the Tuke scheme between 1882 and 1884, 3,215 were from the Clifden Union. This table shows the year, the numbers that departed and their destinations. The map is of the Clifden Union, situated on the west coast of County Galway. In the 1881 census, the Union comprises a little below 200,000 acres and has a population of 24,259. From this, it would seem that over 10% of the population of the Clifden Union took advantage of the Tuke immigration scheme and immigrated to the US or Canada at that time. The immigrants were mostly family groups with some individuals. Those who left were fleeing starvation and poverty. 3 years of poor harvest brought on by extreme bad weather had left them in debt to shopkeepers and behind in their rents. And indeed many of them had recently been evicted from their holdings for non-payment of rent. The Clifden Committee got off to a good start. The ship's manifests for the early sailings were transcribed and uploaded onto the Clifden and Connemara Heritage Society website, clifdenheritage.org. The big disadvantage, however, is that the ship's manifests do not tell us which district or townland the people came from. In September 2014, we published a booklet entitled Mr. Duke's Fund, giving background on Tuke and on the immigration scheme. This can be purchased at ConnemaraGirlPublications.com. We also drew up and printed 9 pull-up information panels and put these on display whenever the opportunity arose to bring the Tuke story to a wider audience. Later that year, over the October bank holiday, we ran a conference with lecturers delivering papers on the topics of immigration, James Hack Tuke, and Connemara in the 1880s. It was well attended, and here we have some of the speakers and organisers. All of this was very visible and drew attention to Tuke and his work. Since then, the work undertaken has been mostly research by me, which is slow and the results are perhaps not as obvious. At the outset, the aim of my research was to link the names on the ship's manifest with the homesteads they left behind. In other words, to identify the townlands they came from. And so I decided to take a look at what are known as the cancelled land books. These are held in the Valuation Office, Abbey Street in Dublin. They are a continuation of Griffith's valuation. The books are available to view in hardback at the Valuations Office, and digitised versions for some counties can also be viewed on internal computers at that office, but they are not yet available online. The cancelled land books show any changes that occurred in the years from the publication of Griffith's valuation in the 1850s up until the early 1990s. My plan was to focus on the 1880s and to identify names that disappear from the cancelled land books at that time, in the hope that the same names would appear in the ship's manifests. Working with the cancelled land books requires time and patience. The entries are handwritten and can be difficult to read, and the years that the changes take place are shown using different coloured inks, which can prove difficult to decipher at times. Nonetheless, They are a wonderful source of material for people involved in genealogy or land research, as they provide a link between Griffith's valuation and the 1901 census. The same headings laid out in Griffith's valuation are used in the council land books, with an additional column for observations in the council land books. This is the page for Ballyconneely for both Griffith's and the council land books. As you can see, the headings for both are the same, with the extra column for observations in the council land books. Now, as I said, my aim was to identify names that disappear from the council land books in the early 1880s and see if they turn up on the ship's manifests. However, given the size of the Clifden Union, it would prove too time-consuming for me to cover the cancelled land books for all townlands in the Union. So instead, I decided to focus on the 24 townlands that lie between Mannin Bay and Sline Head and along the shore of Ballyconneely Bay. This is an area where I know from the newspaper reports that evictions had taken place in the early 1880s. Together, the 24 townlands make up the electoral divisions of Banan and Dunlap. Electoral divisions were introduced under the Poor Law Act of 1838 and consist of a number of townlands grouped together for local election purposes. The ED of Banan comprises 10 townlands, and they are numbered here in brown, and the ED of Dunlap has 14 townlands, numbered in green. Together they cover an area of a little below 11,000 acres. In the period from 1870s to the 1890s, 7 landowners held these 24 townlands. And from the 1881 census figures, we know that the lands were occupied by almost 2,500 men, women and children. I photographed the pages of the cancelled land books for the 24 townlands for the period 1872 to 1891. I then extracted the information from the books for each of the townlands, laid it out on individual spreadsheets and uploaded them to our website, cliftonheritage.org, to make the information available to all. This is the spreadsheet for Ballyconneely. The information in column A to I is as it appears on the original page in the council land books. Column J to L, headed information not on original sheet and subheaded information and comment, year of changes and changes made, were added to provide explanation and clarification. Each entry highlighted in blue shows the entry as it was in 1872. All following entries show any alterations made and the year these changes took place. The townland sheet for the 24 townlands can be accessed through the Clifden and Connemara Heritage Society website, cliftonheritage.org. On the website, you scroll down to the council land books for Errismore and Ballyconneely district for the period 1872 to 1891, seen here in the middle column under the heading Genealogy. By clicking on this, you will be taken to the Galway Community Heritage website. This website is an online archive for communities in County Galway and is supported by the Galway County Council Heritage Office and the National Museum of Ireland. Below the map, seen here at the bottom of the page, is the list of the 24 townlands and an explanation of the material given in the townland sheet. Click on the name of the townland you want to view and this will lead you to the townland sheet, similar to what I just showed for Ballyconneely. You can download the townland sheet if needed. During the course of my research on a close examination of the 1891 census, I spotted a note stating that the drop in population for 6 of my 24 townlands was attributed to immigration. The 6 townlands are listed here along with the statistics from the census. As you can see, there is a sizable drop in each townland. This is where the townlands are located, and although close in proximity, they did not have the same landlord. Now, it seems safe to assume that the people that left these townlands in the 1880s were to be found among the Tuke immigrants. However, when I tried tracking names, it is difficult to be sure. Many surnames are common throughout Connemara. But 2 names did catch my attention. One tenant in Éireann, Mark Gould, number 6, is crossed off in 1883, a Mark Gould shows up on the passenger list for the SS Lake Nepigon, passenger number 7687, departed Galway the 6th of May 1882 for Quebec. Mark, aged 50, was accompanied by his wife, Mary, aged 40, and 5 children. Another tenant in Éireann, number 7, Stephen Grealish, is crossed off at the same time. Now, Stephen Grealish does not appear on the ship's manifest, but there is a Martin Grealish and a Bridget Grealish on the SS Austrian departing Galway for Boston on the 10th of May 1882. Martin, aged 21, and Bridget, a housewife, aged 20, perhaps part of the same family, perhaps not. During the course of this work, it became obvious to me that it would be almost impossible from our side to match immigrants with townlands simply by using the manifests and the council land books. Having an unusual name can help, such as Gould or Grealish, but all too often the names on the manifests are common to all parts of Connemara. However, for those searching from the other direction, a descendant of someone listed on the ship's manifest, the information provided in the townland sheet just might help to lead them to their family roots in Connemara. Some descendants of the Tuke emigrants from the Clifden Union have made contact with us over the years, and one family that visited Clifden in 2017 was able to identify the exact location of the house their family left using the council land books. The house, however, had been demolished. It is hoped that the Valuations Office will eventually make the digitised versions of the council land books available online for all counties in Ireland. This will, of course, make my work on Banan and Dunlap obsolete. But in the meantime, I can only hope that some people find it useful and helpful. For those involved in family research and fortunate enough to know which townland in Connemara their family came from, other online sources available on North Connemara townlands can be found again through the Clifden and Connemara Heritage Society webpage. Returning to clifdenheritage.org, in the bottom left-hand corner is a tab, Local Townlands Online Resources. Clicking on this will take you to the Connemara Roots Northwest Connemara Heritage page on the Galway Community Heritage website. This information was compiled by Roger Harrison and funded by Forum Connemara, and will provide you with access to online sources for each North Connemara townland. These are the web addresses for the website I mentioned: the Valuations Office Dublin, Clifden and Connemara Heritage Society, and the Galway Community Heritage Society. And I can be contacted at my website, connemaragaraldpublications.com. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Antoinette Lydon from the Oughterard Heritage Group. My talk today is Building Bricks to Connections, our approach to connecting with the descendants of James Hack Tuke emigrants. In 2012, my colleague Dave Collins, after meeting with Marie Mannion, Dr. Gerard, Moran, Kathleen, Villiers-Tuthill and the Clifden Group, digitised many of the manifests. Later, I got involved in documenting information on each of the 196 townlands in the civil parish of Kilcommon. All the 196 townlands have been documented on the Oughterard Heritage website. A townland is the smallest administrative division of land in Ireland. It's the parish of Kilcommon within the Poor Law Union of Oughterard and is in the county of Galway. We list former names or other names of the townland. We list what it borders and who was the landlord. The information is the same for each townland, and we work on information from the oldest to the newest. This is a map of the civil parish of Kilcommon, and it stretches from Lough Corrib to the Atlantic, covering an area of 171 square miles. My starting site was the Galway Library's website, and each townland, like I said, is set in the same format with information from the oldest until the newest. The oldest information we could find was from the Downs survey, and that's from the 1640 to 1670,
and it gives a list of the landowners of the time. Next, we worked through the Tidal books. These are rent books from 1823 to 1837. It can be found on the National Archive of Ireland website, and it's a searchable database. I would search by location, but watch for spellings of townlands as they have changed down through the years. Tidal books usually give the following genealogical information: the name of the landowners, the townland within each civil parish of each county, area of landholding, the quality of land for first quality, second, third, fourth, and even in this area, fifth. The tithes, the rent was payable only by occupiers of 5 acres and over. Landless cottagers and urban dwellers were not included. This is an example of the handwritten page of the document. You can zoom in to make it clearer to read. On the left-hand side is the name of the townland. The next section are the rentees. Along on the top, you can see the quality of land, so first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then the rents, the tithes they paid for each type of land and to whom it was paid. The tithe allotments was abolished in 1838. Griffith's valuation is our next, and this is a fantastic census substitute, as we have given the names of those renting lands between 1847 and 1864. This is the main sheet which lists all the townlands and the occupiers. It gives a map reference with letters and/or numbers to show where the land is. The maps also show buildings. So it gives a map reference, the townlands and the occupiers, the immediate lessors who collected the rents, the description, whether it be land and buildings, national schoolhouse gardens, the area, and the rateable value for both the land and the buildings. This valuation system was used as a groundwork for the local taxation, which was continued right up until the 1970s. This is the linked map to each townland. So as you can see that it's all numbered in this section. So Michael Holden that we saw on the previous document has the piece of land marked 24, and Margaret Fitzgerald has land marked number 25. You can also see in the other areas the small dots, which are all buildings. The 1841 to 1891 census sadly does not document people, but it gives the number of people that lived in the townland for each of the census years. It also gives the number of buildings and whether they were inhabited or not. It also breaks it down between males and females. Now on to the most time-consuming part of the project, the 1901 and 1911 census. Each section of the census was transcribed. During this project, I documented approximately 19,500 people, with each household having a hyperlink back to the original document. So I worked through 3 documents: the household return, the house and buildings return, and the out offices and farmsteads outside. Each household description gave the name and ages of the occupants, gave their occupation, where they were born, if they could speak English and Irish, if they could read or write. It also gives information about what type of house they lived in and what outbuildings they had. And it also listed their religion. While documenting each family, I noticed that Coleman and Mary O'Donnell were born in St. Paul. So of course I had to do some research to find some more information on this family. I found Daniel, Maggie and Coleman on the 1885 Minnesota state census and an index for Coleman O'Donnell born in 1883. But I did notice that the mother was down as Mary, not Margaret, so perhaps that was a typo. Also, we found an entry for Daniel in the 1883 St. Paul City Directory with an address in the Connemara patch. Daniel and Margaret married in 1879. At present, I cannot locate them on any ship's manifests. However, the family are back in Ireland by 1887, as Margaret was baptised. There are no civil birth records for any of the children. I have found baptism records for most of the children, so I'm still researching that family. This is the record of Margaret's baptism, so in 1887, so that's how we were able to find that they were back in the country at that. It takes months, if not years, to piece information together. It's not just inputting a name into Google and hey presto, there they are, like some of the TV programs. It does take time. The old age pension was introduced in January of 1909 for people aged over 70. So lots of people got old overnight. I added the link to any townland that I could find an application form for. So this is an example which shows Julia Flaherty applying for a pension in 1916. She states that her parents are Michael and Margaret Flaherty. Her mother's maiden name was McDonough, and there are various notes written on the document. See, on the left-hand side, in very faint, there's a reference to Martin, Bridget, and Ellen. Also, it says, notes, see over. So within the National Library site, you can find this information. It's also attached to each of the townlands. But Margaret and Michael were married in 1831. They had the following children: Thomas, John, Michael, Bridget, and Barbara. Sadly, 3 of the children are listed as dead, and they lived in Carrow North, but there was no return for Julia. So information like this can possibly help in researching family members back to the early 1800s. Townlands.ie is a fantastic website. It shows maps, and it's one thing that it's very useful for is to find bordering townlands. So perhaps you know where your family came from, the townland, and you can't find some information on them. But if you search in the bordering townlands, sometimes you can find some more cousins. Another great site is the Heritage Maps, and they brought in a new feature recently that you can swipe from an old map to a new map. So on the left here, you can see an up-to-date map, and on the right, it gives the old 6-inch black and white map. Again, this could be useful to find an old house, or where the old house was, and that maybe in some cases there might be some ruins of the house still there. Lovely to find if you can. Our first connection was with Leslie Thomas from Minnesota. When I got an email asking about her Flaherty family, I was delighted that the information we had documented had helped her trace her family to Camus. Not alone has the information helped her find where her family came from, but it's also created wonderful, wonderful friendships. You'll hear Leslie's story later. Earlier this year, Rosemary Garrity from Blacksod contacted me with a request she had received from a lady in Texas. Charlene had family history from her mother, but had no idea her family were part of the Tuke scheme. Charlene sent me what information she had on her family, and with a bit of research, I was able to find Kinealy and Devon families on the 1901 and 1911 census. And then with our wonderful network of people within Galway County Heritage, we were able to connect Charlene with a cousin in Dublin. And needless to say, she can't wait to visit We also have some Facebook groups, and recently if there was a request about a family. Patrick and Mary Flaherty were evicted from Tullivrick in Oughterard in 1879 and emigrated to the USA. Their 5 children, aged from 10 to 4 months, were put into the care of the Guardians of the Poor Law Union. However, 5 children with a Mr. Quinn, aged 20, and a Margaret Flaherty, aged 19, are all listed on the SS Prussian in 1883. Mary, their mother's maiden name was Quinn or McQueen, so perhaps the 2 adults that were travelling with the younger children were aunts and uncles. We don't know. But James Hack Tuke would have wanted to reunite families, especially when the parents were in the States. Again, there's more work to do. We all work together, and each piece of information is adding to the fantastic work that we are doing on each side of the Atlantic. It will continue to connect families, and our work continues. Thank you for listening, and you can contact me on oughterardheritage@gmail.com.
Hello everybody, my name is Eileen Davis, and today I am joining you from the Centre to Commemorate the Immigrant, or Clifden in the coastal village of Carna on the Wild Atlantic Way in County Galway. I'm delighted to be part of this conference organised by Galway County Council, and I will talk and speak on the theme of immigration and the connections that we have now forged between the various groups who would have left Connemara and the general area of County Galway and Mayo down through the decades, going back to about 1823 or thereabouts, where records can be found. So basically, decades of immigration and outward migration has led to the evaporation and the fragmentation of the population of Éireann, which is the region of Carna and Kilkerran in the mid-Connemara Gaeltacht region of County Galway. Meaning windy peninsula, Éireann has seen its people spread on the winds of time, especially to the United Kingdom and America, although a local census conducted in 2013 by Clifden and Susan O'Connor shows that current living population of the area's immigrants can be found worldwide. The power of the landlords and their ability to move people at their will to populate their properties in other parts of Connemara adds further confusion to the quest for family origin that the descendants of Éireann immigrants face. Blake, a landlord in the area, populated the island of Immigration, which is off Roundstone, after the famine, with people from the Éireann region, and likewise moved people north to Solrock in the Galway-Mayo border area. Assisted immigrant packages for people to go to the American Midwest in the 1870s and 1880s saw whole families disappear from the Connemara landscape. With no idea of where they were going and not very sure of where they had left, many families lost contact with their immigrant members. In those years, with famine, destitution, and dependency on the whim of a ruling class, survival was the goal. All other considerations were ignored. As time moved on and literacy was improved, later immigrants from Éireann and elsewhere were better able to connect with home. They sent money, parcels, and tickets to their siblings. This is called chain immigration, where many people or many descendants of the same family would go to the same area down through the generations. This saw the traditional destinations of Portland, Maine, Boston, Chicago, Pennsylvania, and New York increase their standing Connemara populations. Men and women, to a lesser degree, engaged in seasonal immigration and migration, going to work harvesting the sugar beet crop in England, going to East Galway, likewise to help with seasonal work. This kept the families afloat With the work taking part in the lean times of the Connemara winter, some of those immigrants stayed on in England, and as with human nature everywhere, they had family, and in some cases children were born outside of a marriage union. The realisation of the need to provide a focal point to commemorate the immigrant came about because of such activities as a magazine that is published here in Connemara, in Éireann. For the past 30 years, this magazine would have kept the immigrant population in contact with the home population, and it gradually became apparent that there was a need for an actual physical focal point for people to focus on. From that, Clifden was built by a voluntary community group called Forum Éireann, but it's built on behalf of the local community and on behalf of the immigrant population worldwide. In 2019, Mary Mangan and the Heritage Office of Galway County Council joined with Rosemary Garrity to host a conference in Clifden, which is the centre built here. The conference had as its focal point the assisted immigrant packages of James Hack Tuke. Dr. Gerard Moran, Kathleen Villiers-Tuthill and others were speakers at that event. Antoinette Lydon of Oughterard and Leslie Thomas of Minnesota took part also. Visiting in the audience were people from the Irish Centre in Portland, Maine, people from Boston and San Diego, as well as New York and Chicago, and not to forget London, England and Scotland. Many in attendance were members of heritage clubs and groups throughout County Galway. Geraldine Mills was poet in residence, and her work, Bone Road, brought the grim reality of hardship to an audience that were learning new facts as to how and why their families had become displaced and oftentimes lost to one another. Rosemary Garrity gave an amazing account of immigration from Blacksod Bay and Achill. Her work is particularly inspiring, professionally documenting the passenger lists and any other information she has received or researched. Rosemary is an inspiration, and she does Trojan work very much alone and by herself in North Mayo. Arising from that conference, many connections have been forged and are being nurtured. For instance, Carna Immigrant Centre with the Irish Centre in Portland, Maine. The connections between those who immigrated to Minnesota are being strengthened with regular meetings between people. Thomas Roach, Michael Carlson, Colin Kern, plus all those with whom we were in contact with, are now all part of the Minnesota Descendants Group, who are connected because of a serendipitous meeting in Carna with Leslie Thomas, brought about by Antoinette Lydon. Recently, we have made contact with the Irish community in St. John's, Newfoundland, thanks to Damien Brazil, whose family left Donegal. St. John was oftentimes the place many people disembarked from the coffin ships, going ashore. Women whose husbands had died in transit, older people who weren't fit for the journey any longer, women who were about to give birth. Some settled there, more took a second boat down the coast to Portland, Maine, where the harbour that did not freeze provided work year-round. These people became known as the two-boat Irish. The sheep herders who went west, the people who went to the Klondike and north to Alaska, have roots here in Connemara, and we continue to keep the connections alive, not just from Clifden, but all of the rest of us who are involved in this conference here today. Terry Fitzgerald is a genealogist with Clifden based in San Diego, and she works tirelessly to document and trace family for anybody who may be interested. The Centre in Carna provides information on births, deaths and marriages, as well as cultural, language, heritage and many more parts of human life that are important for people who are away from these areas to understand. Roger Harrison, working with Forum Connemara and Galway Heritage Office, has documented the townlands of West Galway, which are available on Galway County Council's website. All of this work combines to provide the material required for family finding and ensures that the connections remain in place. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this event.
My ancestors were one of 10 families from Dunlap who were selected to go on the Tuke assisted emigration scheme. So my great-grandparents, Philip and Mary Heverin, and their 6 children, one of them, my grandmother, set sail from Ely Bay on the north coast of Mayo in 1883. And the poem I'm going to read is called Leaving. Leaving. The longest days still entering their dawn, they follow the carts of hopefuls along the famished track down to the sea. Beyond the calm waters of Ely Bay, the SS Waldensian lies anchored, brighter than any golden hoard offered to Manannán, the sea god. There are scant tears for their passages paid, new clothes on their backs, landing money promised. The whole family going, my great-grandparents, 6 children, 10-year-old Bridget, my grandmother, that's Tuke's deal.
Hello, my name is Jane Kennedy, and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I am here today to talk about James Hack Tuke and the background I have researched about Mr. Tuke. And then I want to talk a little bit about how Mr. Tuke has been an influence on my own family. So let me begin a little bit with the background that I have on Mr. Tuke. Now, he, in my own words, is somebody who has literally saved my family. And that is why I have decided to do research on Mr. Tuke and find out what I could so that I can not only understand what he has done for my family, but also help other families, other descendants here in the United States understand what he has done for so many people that are living here that have been saved because of him. So my understanding of Mr. Tuke is that he was born in York, England, and at a very young age of age 9, he lost his mother. His mother died and left a family of about 12 children to live without a mother, basically. Early in Mr. Tuke's life, he contracted typhoid fever, and so he was not totally healthy all his life, and he later became even more sick as he contracted other diseases from working with people that were infected with fever. But Mr. Tuke was a member, his family was the Society of Friends. He was a Quaker, and he was brought up to help other people. And he learned this from his dad, obviously, his mother to some extent. And you can see that how his religion really played an important part in his life throughout his life. Now, again, I mentioned he was one of 12 children in the family. And during the Great Famine, a lot of people, a significant number of people, fled to York, England. And at this time, the town was trying not to accept them. They did not help build buildings to help care for the sick people who were suffering from typhoid. But Mr. Tuke and his father did set up a hospital to take in some immigrants who were coming from Ireland, who were in a very bad situation. Now, in 1846, let's just take a look at the area of Belmullet, the Belmullet region in Ireland, which is in the way northwest corner of the country, which happens to be where my family is from. In 1846, the Belmullet region had a population of 28,000 people. 2,000 of those people immigrated to York, England. 6,000 people perished from starvation, dysentery, and fever, and 20,000 remained. And half of those 20,000 literally were on the verge of starvation. Mr. Tuke felt obligated, felt a desire to help these people. In November of 1847, Tuke addressed a committee of the Society of Friends in Dublin, and he came up with some ideas to help cure Ireland from the famine. And among those ideas were to help them reclaim land, to improve the employment situation there, set up working of the new poor law, and also improve communication between the west of Ireland and the east of Ireland. So Tuke did a lot of work to help during the Great Famine. And he was hoping that things would continue to get better after the famine. Again, when he would come, he would get contributions from his friends over in England. They would contribute money, and he would bring this money to the poor, starving people in Ireland to help them. But he wanted to do more than just contribute money. He wanted to help them in whatever way he can, so that this is not a returning problem where they could get this famine behind them. When he came in 1880 to Dublin, he met with people there in the west of Ireland, in the east of Ireland, and he saw that there had been some significant improvement there, and he felt relieved at that. Yet, what he saw in the west of Ireland when he went there was more of the same. This ongoing, it was pretty much, things were pretty much going the way they had been prior to the Great Famine. And this was very distressing to Mr. Tuke. What he did was he decided that he was going to work with other people to see if he could help bring some people from the west of Ireland to the United States, into Canada, to help them. Because what was happening with the people, particularly in the western part of Ireland, were living on these very small farms with very small acreage that were not enough to support families. And ironically, or not, after the Great Famine, the population in Western Ireland grew rapidly. So there was almost a population explosion. Now, this feature was something that was pretty unique to the western part of Ireland and not all of Ireland. So you can imagine already you've got a base of starving people, and there are more young people being added, more mouths to feed. And so Tuke realizes that something has to be done to help with this. There had been, I wouldn't say it was controversial, but there had been discussion as to whether helping people immigrate to another country was the best approach to helping solve the issues of additional famines after the Great Famine. And now I'm really looking at the famine that occurred in 1879, predominantly in the western part of Ireland. But again, Tuke, with the help of many others, including Father Nugent, also from England, decided that they were going to do what they could to help get some people to move to the United States and to Canada. And so this was a major undertaking, but Mr. Tuke felt that it was necessary and that it would truly help. So at this point, what Mr. Tuke started to do was he went to the western part of Ireland, and he literally would find the right people to, and when I say right people, I will describe that in a minute here, to bring those people, bring them to the United States to help them find a new and perhaps hopefully better life, and also to Canada. So what he was looking for was specifically, he was looking for families and not individuals. One member of the family at least had to speak English. Also, he was looking for people who were there. Somebody had to be there, enough people in the family who would be considered breadwinners. And then also, he wanted the immigrants, and I find this really hard to believe, but he also wanted the immigrants to be able to help pay for some part of their transport. But here's what Mr. Tuke did. So he set about interviewing it was just within the first week he went to the Belmullet region. He interviewed 1,276 people who were interested in leaving Ireland to find a better life in North America. And so what Tuke was involved in doing actually was literally inviting people to come and meet with him, where he and a group of other people would literally interview these people. And again, Mr. Tuke was there for all of this. He wasn't just delegating work to other people to do. He was the lead on this. He would invite people to come who were interested in leaving. He would interview them. He would make sure that they met the qualifications that he was looking for. And then he would help provide them with some money, provide them with clothing. He helped arrange the shipping transportation. He made sure, he tried to find people like a priest or another individual who would accompany these large ships of people to the United States or Canada. And then he literally would escort these people when they were leaving to come to the United States or Canada. He would go with them to the port to wish them well. And he made sure that there was somebody when they landed in the United States or Canada who would be there to help them in that next step, help them either get into the next mode of transportation or help them find work. So he had thought through everything that was necessary to help the people, not just push them away from the island of Ireland, but help them truly find that better life. Now, I would like to talk to you a little bit about how my family personally was impacted by Mr. Tuke. And I know this only through research, obviously, but this is what I have found to be true, is that my family was one of those immigrant families who Mr. Tuke helped. I know this for a fact. My family lived in the region of Belmullet. My great-grandfather was from Cross, and my great-grandmother was from Binghamstown. And the two little towns on the peninsula are very close to one another. So my family was a farming family, and they were chosen to come to the United States to seek a better life. There were a number of children in my great-grandfather's family. Now, my family left on May 26th in 1883, and they left from the southern tip of the peninsula, Ely Bay, and from there they took a small dinghy out to the large boat called the Austrian. There were 356 families family members on board the Austrian. And I'm assuming the weather was good weather for sailing, but when they left on May 26th of that year, 1883, and they arrived on June 7th. Now, my family at that time consisted of my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, who were both 30 years old. At that time, they had 4 children. My grandfather was the oldest. His name was Martin, and he was age 8. Martin had a brother, age 6, named Patrick. And then there was Annie, who was 4. And then the youngest was a daughter named Sabina, who was 2. So my great-grandparents came over at the age of 30 with 4 children. They landed in Boston, Massachusetts, again on June 7th, 1883. And from there, I don't have all of the details, but in researching others who have come to the Midwest in the United States, specifically a group of people from the Connemara region, my assumption is that my family, after they arrived in Boston, took a train from Boston to Western Wisconsin, which is the neighboring state of Minnesota. My family then settled in Western Wisconsin. They settled in a town in two towns in western Wisconsin. One was called Éireann Prairie, and the other was called Emerald. And you better believe they were very Irish little communities in Wisconsin. And if you look at a plat of the land back in the late 1890, the early 1900s, and you look at the members of the people who were on the ship, the Austrian, with my family, you'll see that their neighbors in Wisconsin are the same people that were on that boat with them when they left Ireland. So they stayed together. They had that community support from one another, which had to be so important for my family. Now, eventually, my family in the 1930s, you've obviously are aware of the Great Depression that happened here in the United States. My family lost their farm in the early 1930s. And then at that point, they proceeded to come to Minnesota, to St. Paul, Minnesota. I am probably about 45 minutes away from where my great-grandmother and great-grandfather are buried. They're buried in a little cemetery in Éireann Prairie called St. Patrick's Church Cemetery. And it brings me comfort to be able to go there and visit with them. Now, I cannot find exactly where my great-grandfather is buried. There is no marker that indicates where he's buried. But my grandmother died in 1890. So she was not living very long here in the United States. She lived here 7 years. But she has a large obelisk monument with her name on it. And it says that she came from County Mayo, the year of her birth, the year of her death, and her name. And she too is still among the very people that she came over with on that boat so long ago in that cemetery in western Wisconsin. Because if you walk through the graveyard, if you walk through the cemetery, you'll see the same names of people who are on that ship, who are now buried with my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather in that very cemetery. So that is the story really of my family and how Mr. Tuke helped my family come here. And I've said this many times. After I've done my research, I firmly believe that if it was not for Mr. Tuke and the generosity that he shared with so many people from Ireland who were starving, who were part of that famine of 1879, and certainly the Great Famine, my family would not have survived. Or if they had, it would have been an even much more poor existence to have been left in Ireland to struggle through the famine, through the sickness, and through everything. So I am very grateful to Mr. Tuke for what he did, for having the generosity of helping my family. And I will always personally work to help do what I can to eliminate poverty and famine here in this country, because it's very touching. It's just the whole story of the Irish people suffering from the famine and how it's impacted, how the ripple effect has continued to impact the descendants here in the United States, in Canada, and throughout the world. Thank you very much for your time.
This is the story of my Flaherty family who emigrated from Camus to St. Paul with assistance from James Hack Tuke's Emigration Fund. What I know about them today involved the help of many kind people, family members, newly met cousins and friends, the dedicated folks at Carna Immigrants Commemorative Center, Oughterard Heritage Group, Minnesota Historical Society, Connemara Facebook genealogy groups, and authors writing on the important subjects of famine and emigration from Connemara. I'm deeply grateful for all the assistance I've received and the new friendships I've made along the way. Please note that what I know of my family story keeps evolving as I learn more information each year. My great-grandmother's name is Mary Elizabeth Flaherty Hartigan. She was born in 1870 in Upper Camus to William Flaherty and Anne Stewart. I don't know much about her life since she died before I was born, but I recall my mother telling me that she once asked her grandmother if she missed Ireland, to which Mary responded, "No, there was nothing there for me." I found it incredibly sad that as a young person, Mary did not see a future with possibilities. However, I'm not certain she didn't miss Ireland. Many years later, my mom told me about a song her father, Mary's son, used to sing called Galway Bay. That would have been the last place Mary saw before leaving Ireland forever at 13 years old. I've spent time looking for clues to what my family's life was like in Camus, as told from the perspective of their community. I've only found a few excerpts so far. For example, I was curious about the church they attended and found an article in the Gaelic Journal from 1897, 14 years after my family emigrated to Minnesota. It reads, "The dedication of the Camus Church in Connemara will take place on 15 August. This church has been erected in a very poor district in the wilds of Connemara by the untiring exertions of Father Joseph Cassidy, Rosmuck, Mamcross, County Galway, replacing the old thatched chapel, last of its kind in Ireland. The sermon will be preached in Irish by an accomplished Irish preacher, Reverend M.D. Conroy, as this is perhaps the first occasion in the century on which a dedication sermon has been preached in Irish. Those who love the national tongue should avail themselves of the opportunity to be present. We are sure that many of our readers will not fail to show their appreciation of the importance of this event by, if possible, participating in its celebration. After reading this, I wondered if my family heard the news, how they felt about their old church being replaced and not being able to attend this important event. Mary's father, William, was born around 1835, and I've not been able to confirm his parents or any siblings for him yet. He lists himself as a laborer and a small farmer on his children's birth records. But the only document I can find regarding land tenancy for William is one from 1875, stating that he rented a joint holding in Lower Camus. My great-great-grandmother, Anne Stewart, was born around 1842 and lived in Annagvan before marrying William. She had at least 3 brothers, Michael, Patrick, and Coleman. Coleman died young, but his wife and children emigrated to St. Paul, as did Patrick, Michael, and their families. Anne's parents were Bridget Flaherty of Garumna and Michael Stewart Sr. I learned from the Griffith valuation that Michael held a lease to harvest seaweed in nearby Inishlesk. From the same document, I also learned that he lived at J, and from the map feature, I was able to locate the exact location. There are only 2 mentions I can find in the records about Anne. Besides her children's birth and baptisms, she sponsored a baptism, and shortly after Anne and William were married in 1864, my young great-great-grandparents were accused of cutting and carrying away seaweed from someone else's plot along the shore in Rosmuck. Leaving home. On April 21, 1883, William, Anne, Mary, and 4 of her siblings, Dudley, Anne, Coleman, and Bridget, left Camus and boarded the SS Austrian at Galway Bay for Boston. Their oldest son, Martin, emigrated at a different time, and we haven't found the details of his departure yet. And as far as I know, 2 of their children did not emigrate, and I don't know what happened to them. Their final destination, as stated on the ship record, was St. Paul to become settlers, and they had a total of 2 bags between them. Was this everything they owned? If not, I wondered how they determined what to bring and what to leave behind. Their ocean journey lasted 12 days, arriving Boston on May 2nd, 1883. I have no firsthand accounts of my family's experience while on board the SS Austrian, and while much has been written regarding the deplorable conditions many experienced while on these ships, much less has been explored about the effects the transatlantic journeys had on immigrants. One study by Denise Rose Delgadio describes the process of emigration as a rite of passage, comprised of 3 stages: separation from Europe, liminality, the period on board the ship, and aggregation, the arrival in North America. Delgadio asserts that the liminal stage during the transatlantic voyage often served as a transitory period that bridged immigrants' lives between the old and new worlds. She further explains, in order to understand how the voyage acted as a liminal period, one must consider passengers' vulnerability and the conditions they endured, as well as the forces that pressured them to slowly shed elements of their native cultures. Immigrants were compelled to give up cultural belongings and forced to withstand oppressive physical conditions that diminished them and challenged their former identities. The journey also introduced immigrants to the multi-ethnic community that they would encounter in the US and promoted cooperation between these future fellow citizens. I have no way of knowing if my family felt pressure to shed their Irishness as they steamshipped further away from her shores, but it is possible. After my family arrived in Boston, family lore says that my great-grandmother stayed in Boston at an Irish house for a bit, while others went ahead to St. Paul to get settled. According to a cousin, the story goes, Mary, who was 13 years old, cleaned offices at night. One evening, 2 businessmen in the building, while she was cleaning, started arguing. One man swore at the other, to which he responded, "Watch your language, there's a young girl here." The other man shouted, "She is just a stupid Irish girl who probably doesn't speak English." Well, Mary did speak English, and after hearing that insult, threw the hot, dirty bucket of water at the man and ran out of the building. Back at the Irish house, they told her she needed to leave immediately or risk being returned to Ireland. They hid her in a steamer trunk on a railroad going to St. Paul. Tuke recipients were required to have a family member or close friend willing to house and assist them upon their arrival to the US. And the journey to their final destination was fully funded. If my family did split up in Boston, this may be unusual for Tuke recipients, though the practice of heads of households securing work and a place to live before their family joined him was common amongst early US settlers. The records show only William and his oldest son Dudley living in St. Paul in 1883, staying at the same location, a temporary landing spot for new immigrants, and working as laborers. My family traveled on the British-owned Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, which was the major railroad in the province of Canada. They went from Boston to Montreal, then to Chicago, where they likely boarded the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad for the last leg of their long journey to St. Paul. On May 2nd, 1883, the St. Paul Daily Globe published an article shared by telegram from Montreal about Tuke-assisted emigrants. It reads in part, "A genuine specimen on an extensive scale of Irish destitution and poverty was witnessed here today by the arrival of 300 immigrants from Connemara County en route by the Grand Trunk to St. Paul, Minnesota, with the intention of settling in that state. They were accompanied by a young priest to whom they looked to for counsel and assistance, as they were all in an impecunious condition. Their appearance was indeed miserable in the extreme. Each were poorly clad for this climate, and a great many were without shoes. They were mostly in families and seemed careworn and emaciated, no doubt by the effects of hunger at home The article goes on to say, the party is an installment of those sent out by the Tukes Committee. It will take them considerable time to recuperate their wasted strength before they can go to work vigorously on lands. I have no doubt Tuke assisted immigrants were weary and hungry upon their arrival. After living in poverty in Ireland and then undertaking an arduous journey to the US, who wouldn't be? Though my family, and I suspect many others, began vigorous work immediately after arriving in St. Paul, despite their condition. They were accustomed to surviving difficult conditions, and I suspect come from a long line of resilient people. A new life in Minnesota. Before discussing my family's lives in St. Paul, I must first acknowledge that the land they settled on and the land where I currently reside is and has been homeland to the Dakota people for over 12,000 years. Despite past government efforts to exterminate or diminish their presence, the Dakota people are still here. When William first arrived in St. Paul in 1883, he was a boarder at 158 Water Street and the St. Paul House. He worked as a laborer and a street sweeper for the St. Paul Public Works Department. His sons became laborers for the railroads, and his daughters worked as domestics and laundresses for hotels. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this happened, but it appears that shortly after William arrived, he purchased a residential lot for $500, equal to $14,000 today with inflation, in St. Paul's West Side Flats neighborhood along the Mississippi River. Then, on June 3rd, 1883, he applied for a permit to build a home. It would be a modest home, a 1.5-story wooden frame dwelling with a 1-story kitchen wing at the rear of the house and a wood shingle roof. Behind the house, there would be a shed and barn. A side porch on the south side of the kitchen wing exited toward the house on the corner. The cost to build the home was also $500. The garage was built first on the back half of the lot and used as temporary housing for the family. William and Anne rented the front half of the lot to help earn money for the construction of their new home. At some point, William sold his lot to George Adams for $500 plus interest, either to assist with financing, or if he had already paid for the lot in full, he may have mortgaged the lot to pay for the home construction. However it happened, construction on the home began sometime in 1884. By mid-August of 1886, William had the property paid in full, their home finished and paid for completely, and my great-great-grandparents held a deed of ownership in their hands. They were industrious new settlers. In the 1885 census, the entire family is living together at their new home on State Street, including boarders Mary and Martin Conroy. They settled with friends and families nearby, across the river in Connemara Patch, including the Stewarts, my great-great-grandmother's family, and others from Connemara who had participated in Bishop Ireland's graceful emigration scheme. The West Side Flats of St. Paul is lowland, prone to flooding from the Mississippi River. For a time, it was known as Connemara Row. Historically, the neighborhood has been the first home to poor new immigrants. They lived in tightly packed, small homes, and I imagine there was a fair amount of noise and pollution due to nearby industry. My family lived here until 1908, but their home remained intact until the clearance of the West Side Flats began after the 1952 flood. My family arrived St. Paul as it was experiencing significant expansion, just 25 years after Minnesota attained statehood. Rail lines were constructed across the city, and Minnesota became a major transportation gateway to the West. On September 3rd, 1883, St. Paul hosted an international celebration to mark the completion and grand opening of the Northern Pacific Railway, dubbed as connecting St. Paul to China. Labor during this boom was in high demand, and immigrants moved into the city in record numbers. Between 1880 and 1890, the population of St. Paul exploded from 31,000 to 133,000 residents. My family would have crossed paths with people of many diverse cultures and languages, even while living in proximity to people who shared their nationality and faith. However, despite these economic opportunities, times were difficult for many, including my family. In St. Paul, wealth was delineated by elevation. The more you had, the higher you lived, away from the noise and pollution in the city. My family lived along the floodplain of the Mississippi River, about as low in elevation one can get on land. My great-great-grandfather was nearly 50 years old when he emigrated to the US, and he worked most of his life. Although he figured out a way to own a home early on, much to his credit, they got by on working class wages. And like most families, we had relatives who worked hard and some who struggled to find their way. I think the sting and stigma of poverty is persistent. Perhaps no one expressed this better than 9-year-old Billy Flaherty, who was sent to a reformatory for truancy in the early 20th century. At school, I wasn't happy. Why, you will probably ask. Because I was a child of the slums, unmannered, ill-bred, badly attired. This caused many of my classmates to dislike me and caused me to be repulsive to my teacher. It was through this that I became unhappy at school. Through it all, my family remained deeply religious after emigrating and attended St. Michael's Church. It's where Anne and William's children were married as well. St. Michael's began in 1866 as a mission of the Cathedral of St. Paul and was first located in downtown. It moved across the Mississippi River to the West Side Flats to address the needs of Catholic Irish immigrants living there who could not afford the $1 toll to cross the Wabasha Street Bridge into downtown each Sunday for Mass. There's a story I recently learned about my great-grandmother Mary, telling her 5-year-old daughter Kate to give their priest a nickel for a prayer she wanted answered. Kate brought the nickel to the priest, but the priest told her he knew her family did not have much and told her to return the nickel to her mother, along with the assurance that her prayer would still be relayed. Kate did as she was told, but Mary was upset and worried that her prayer would not be answered without the nickel. She instructed Kate to go back to St. Michael's and insist that the priest take her nickel. Again, Kate did as she was told, and again the priest told her he would not accept her nickel. Kate was stuck between the word of God and the will of her mother. In the end, it was her mother she feared most, and she hid the nickel on her way home. I'd give anything to know what Mary's prayer was for. St. Michael's Church recently closed due to low membership. Today, only the church bell tower remains in what is now a vibrant and predominantly Latin American neighborhood. In 1908, after all their children were married with their own families, William and Anne sold their home on State Street to a Jewish family who later converted it into a neighborhood grocery store. They bought a similar size home up the hill at 38 Atwater Street, built in 1889. Although their new location was still considered a lower income area for railroad workers, it would have been an upgraded neighborhood for them, out of the floodplain. The Atwater home stayed in the family until at least 1934. After the move, William continued to work as a laborer on the streets of St. Paul. Here's a little information about Anne and William's 6 children who emigrated to the US. Martin married Bridget Walsh and had 9 children. For many years, he lived on Fenton Street in the West Side Flats, not far from the family home on State Street. He was a laborer in the factory, and Bridget was a homemaker. Martin was also a proud member of the ancient order of the Hibernians, and his cape remains in their family. One of Martin's sons became a wagon driver, one was a butler, and a daughter was a laundress. Dudley was a laborer and active in St. Paul city government as a delegate for St. Paul, Ward 6, as a citizen Democrat in 1898. He first married Bridget O'Donnell and had 2 children, but Bridget died young not long after giving birth to their second son. Dudley then remarried Mary McDonough, and they had 3 children. The family story is that Mary came to the US unmarried from Ireland to work as an indentured servant for James J. Hill at his mansion on Summit Avenue. Sadly, Mary also died young, and Dudley and his 5 children moved in with Anna William. A descendant of Dudley shared this story. Our grandpa told us his mother died during childbirth, and his grandmother Anne raised him with his dad. She only spoke Irish, so he had to learn it, adding, "My grandpa Dudley Joseph Flaherty was a delivery driver. My dad, Dudley, was also a delivery driver. And then my brother Dudley worked for the City of St. Paul Water Department." Anne married Patrick Carter, and they had 8 children in St. Paul. Patrick was a blacksmith helper. I learned that a couple of Anne and William's children were excellent baseball players on a team preceding the St. Paul Saints, and the entire family watched these games. Anne's granddaughter told me her uncles played baseball. She added, "They were very good athletes. One was a boxer in Chicago and made a lot of money, but he died young. Our uncles were very colorful characters." And my mother made sure her brothers were properly buried in the Catholic Church. She took care of everyone. She was a strong woman, as her parents had to be to take the risk of coming to the US. My grandfather was successful, but died at age 49. My grandmother Anne stayed in Boston for a few years, working as a milliner. I was 7 when she died, and she lived with us most of my early life. Coleman married Barbara Flaherty in Spokane, and they had 6 children. They moved to Washington around 1894 and San Francisco in 1900, presumably following railroad construction west for work. The family returned to St. Paul in 1905. While living on State Street next to his parents, Coleman was a laborer. One of their sons tragically drowned in the Mississippi River while chasing after a baseball when he was just 11 years old. One of their daughters worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad. After Coleman died, Barbara remarried Thomas McDonough in St. Paul. Bridget married John Ryan and had 1 son, Francis. They divorced soon after, and she remarried Francis Davies. They moved to Utah, had no children, and divorced shortly after. Bridget then moved to California to live with her son and his family, which is where she lived until she died. Mary, my great-grandmother, worked as a laundress until she married Michael Hartigan in 1896. They had 8 children in St. Paul. Michael was a blacksmith helper at the railroad engine shop, and Mary was a homemaker. At some point, they moved from the inner city of St. Paul to renting a home up the hill closer to Michael's work. They never owned their own home, and I learned that Mary never celebrated holidays in the commercial sense, perhaps due to their lack of money. Once, Michael surprised her with a real Christmas tree that he found. He put it up in the house against her wishes, and they decorated it with real fire candles. Unfortunately, The tree fell and burned the wall behind it. Mary took the tree outside, moved the couch against the burnt wall, and only said, "That is the last tree we will ever have in the house." Sometime during the 1930s, during the Depression, Mary moved to Chicago with 3 of her sons to find work. She died in Chicago in 1944 and was brought back to St. Paul to be buried next to her husband. Mary's grandson shared this story with me. "I grew up in St. Paul and was the youngest of 11 children. Our street had a lot of Irish and Jewish lower middle class families. Everyone got along very well. 2 blocks south was the upper class area. A friend of mine who lived in the richer area was the son of the owner of a big construction company. Another's father was a federal judge who was involved in many big cases. But my friends spent a lot of time at my house because they thought it was like a circus, with so many people coming and going. It seemed like we always had a cousin or an uncle or an aunt staying with us. They just liked all the crazy stuff we did. And believe me, they could have made a movie about all the hijinks that went on there. We did not have a lot of money, but I did have a happy childhood for the most part. We were only about 6 blocks from the governor's mansion, a world apart in riches, but I guess we were rich in another way. We had family, a large, close-knit family. Of these 11 children, the 7 boys all served in the US military during wartime. Each served honorably. Sadly, 2 sons died, one after earning 3 Purple Hearts. William Flaherty died in St. Paul in 1926. He was 92 years old. His cause of death was listed as exposure and exhaustion, wandered away from home. Family lore says William was found leaning against a tree with his hands clinging to a rosary. And Stuart Flaherty died in 1923. She and William were married for 63 years. They are buried in the same plot with their daughter, Anne, and her husband, Patrick Carter. We have spent considerable time digging for the sunken grave markers of our Flaherty family members. We discovered Anne and William have no grave marker, and a family member is in the process of obtaining one for them. As I write this essay about my family, I can't help but wonder what my great-grandmother would think of it. Did I get it right? Have I missed the most important elements? Would she want me sharing it? I'll never know. But perhaps my ongoing inadequate attempt to remember her and her family's struggles is a symbol of the success of Tuke's immigration program. Today, I am in relative comfort because of their Herculean efforts, their deep well of strength and ability to survive. They were rich in the ways that matter most. And because they took a chance, said, yes, we'd like to apply for immigration assistance, I am grateful. They left everything they knew for a foreign land, their family, landscape, language, and landmarks. I imagine their decision was based on what they knew at the time, that their prospects for a better future were grim. I believe Tuke's program gave them hope, a future with possibilities. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Lynch. I'm the Executive Director of the Irish American Archives Society in Cleveland, and I'm going to talk to you today about the impact of the Tuke immigration scheme with an emphasis on Cleveland. It's long been known that there's a strong connection between Cleveland and County Mayo, especially Achill Island, Achill Parish. We have an active Mayo Society in Cleveland. Cleveland and Achill are twinned communities. And as Executive Director of the Irish American Archives Society, which focuses on the history of the Irish in Cleveland, I've been looking into the nature of those connections and the background for them. I became aware of the significance of the Tuke scheme for Cleveland as I started to hear about the work of the Heritage Center in Aughterard on the Belmullet Peninsula. I began to be especially interested when I began to understand that the Tuke immigration scheme affected communities ringing the entirety of Blacksod Bay. So that meant Achill as well as communities on the Belmullet Peninsula. I started looking at I found and started interacting with the website blacksodbayimmigration.ie. Extremely important resource for all of those interested in this topic. On the website, we can find the results of the transcription of all of the passenger manifests for all of the sailings that left from Blacksod Bay. The transcriptions were done by Rosemary Garrity for the main part. She took the lead on that, and also on populating the website, which has a searchable database and a mechanism for crowdsourcing information about passengers, primarily from descendants. I corresponded with Rosemarie. She and a delegation from the Heritage Center came to Cleveland in 2015. One of the institutions I took them to visit was John Carroll University, a local university here. And in spring of 2016, I launched a annual spring internship, research internship with John Carroll University History Department students. Our goal would be to find the Tuke passengers, especially those bound for Cleveland, but we soon realized that we had to find all of them in order to make sure that we had those who were actually ended up in Cleveland. Our research to date has yielded information on 6 sailings. We have a lot to go, 9 to be exact, but we're beginning to be in a position where we can begin to add up some of the research, consolidate it, figure out how to share it in a way that will aid family history researchers, as the website Blacksod Bay Immigration does, but also future historians. If you look at the website itself, there's a lot of information about James Hack Tuke, the background for the scheme, and also the Tuke sailings that left from Blacksod Bay. There are more than 3,000 passengers chronicled on this website. They came to North America in 15 sailings in 1883 and 1884. On the website, the passengers are grouped by sailing on the homepage, and then within each sailing, they're grouped by sailing party, and each sailing party has a page on the website. A sailing party is a group of people that travel together, usually family group. And for each sailing party, there's some information if it's known, and that includes the townland of origin, where they came from, and where they stated on the manifest that they were going to. There's also information about passengers. The names and ages and gender are on the passenger manifests, so that information is also directly on the website. You can also have crowdsourced information, as this page does. There's a picture of one of the passengers on the page, Dennis Kinealy, probably the head of this sailing party. There could be other information added by descendants if known. Through the searchable aspect of the website, you can search the destinations and find that Pennsylvania and Ohio were the leading destinations given by the passengers on the manifests. As we started researching them, we're looking for individuals, but we realized quickly that we're looking for them. They're often they're leaving in family groups, and they're often staying together, and usually at the outset they're found together. So we're tracking individuals and family groups, and we begin to, we're following the lead of the Blacksod Bay website about what a family group might be. The site takes a stab at defining those. Some of the manifests bracket each family group together, but most of them don't. So it's an educated guess as to what a family group might be. And the Blacksod Bay Emigration website is a starting point, as I said, but research can suggest refinements to that understanding of what a family group might be. For example, on this manifest, we have a couple, an older couple, Michael and Margaret Corduff, an unknown individual woman, Kate Moore, and then a group headed by a woman named Bridget Hogan and several children. In Bridget Hogan's death record in the United States, we find that her parents are named Michael Cardiff and Margaret Joyce Cardiff, and therefore these people in the passenger manifest ahead of her are undoubtedly her parents. We haven't established who Kate Moore is. We could regard them as a family group traveling together, but because Kate Moore is in the middle and we haven't identified her relationship to them, but also because they don't actually end up in the same destination in the United States, we make the decision that family relationships don't always match up with destinations. So for us, the definition of a family group became people related as a family, plus an interrelated trajectory in the US or North America. That is to say that they're going to the same destination together. And we did find many instances where there is a sort of a trailing older woman at the end of a family group, and often found out that this is a mother or mother-in-law of the family, and we're able to associate them, and they did end up going in the same direction to the same location with the rest of the family, and therefore we define them together as a family group. As we're doing the research, we had to figure out ways to memorialize it, gather it together, organize it, and we developed two important vehicles for that tracking of the research. The first is that for every sailing party or family group, as we might call them, we're creating a Word doc that we're calling a finder's document. We're looking for our people in public records available online. These are mostly online sources that cater to people doing family history research. And they become quite sophisticated, and most of them have search reports that they deliver that kind of summarize the document. And we copy the entire search report into a Word doc. Not only does it give us an information about the people who are listed together in whatever public document it might be, in this case, a census record, but often information is summarized, such as whether they can read and write, how many children were born to a mother, how many children were still alive. So there's quite a lot of information. The finder's documents become quite lengthy because we're including the documents for every individual passenger in that group. Come up to about 40 pages sometimes more. So we needed another vehicle to sort of do a higher level summary of the information. And we've developed spreadsheets for each sailing. Started out with a limited number of fields that we were tracking, and soon realized that just began adding more and more fields. Now we have upwards of possibly 100 fields or information that we're tracking, and creating searchable, sortable databases for. So we've got 6 sailings so far. As I said, these are the sailings that we've done. 5 of the 6 were headed to Boston, one of the primary locations or destinations of the Tuke sponsored sailings, but one was going to Quebec. The other stated destination of the Tuke sailings. These 6 sailings account for 1,500 passengers roughly in 324 sailing parties. We found 46% of the sailing parties in their stated destination when there was a stated destination. We found another 18% in another destination. We don't know, haven't been able to document whether they went to their original stated destination first and then detoured quickly, or whether they never went to their destination at all. We have found that there's an average of about 20.5% rate of never find. There's also sort of a smaller gray area of people that we've possibly found but can't identify with as much certainty. So here's some of the basic demographics that we're finding in those 6 sailings. There's slightly more women than men, 53.5% women, 46.5% men. Most strikingly, more than half the passengers are 18 years of age and younger. Very young boat, including 60 infants over those 6 sailings, some as young as 2 days old. Imagine traveling on an ocean voyage with a 2-day-old infant. Incredible. Less than 1% of the passengers identified themselves as older than 60. That might not be entirely accurate, because we find that older people in particular went too precise about date of birth. But even so, you can see that the demographics of the sailing shifted or skewed very young. So it wasn't surprising to find out that many of the young families on these sailings continued to have children after they settled in North America. And we also began to find out that the very youngest passengers weren't dying until fairly recently, within my lifetime, certainly. The last identified death year that we've been able to find so far is 1985. All of these demographics point towards the fact that there were a lot of families on these boats with younger children. And then we began to look at the family makeup and found that indeed 50% of the sailing parties were what we today would call a nuclear family with 2 parents and children. There was another 22% consisting of single parents and children. Most often the single parents were mothers, and about almost a third of those were people who were later reunited with a spouse. In other words, they weren't widowed, but their spouse had gone on ahead to North America to get settled before the family came and joined them. The emphasis on families, with more than 72% of the passengers grouped in some kind of family with a parent and children, accords with the goals of the Tuke immigration scheme. There's a line from the reports that Tuke and some of his assistants published at the end of the first year, at the end of the 1883 year. That said, I made it also a rule in case of families that the whole family should go or none. So that is reflected in the statistics on the family. And in addition to the sort of traditional family group, you have 11.5 in other configurations like group of siblings or other relatives, but you do have 16.5% of the passengers seemingly traveling alone, or at least we have not yet been able to figure out what their relationship is to the other people around them. And those passengers traveling alone account for a great number of the majority of, shall we say, of the can't find category, because there's no context, nothing we can associate them with, and making that all makes it very difficult to identify them with certainty in North America. The mean and average family size sort of coalesce around the number 6, and that usually includes 2 parents and 4 children. The departures from the Blacksod Bay reflected people coming from 4 civil parishes surrounding Blacksod Bay. And in the Tuke report, there's a map that sort of indicates in this sort of khaki green color the areas that Tuke originally proposed to assist. The actual areas became a little more adjusted as time went on, and he did assist people in this area along the edge of the bay in Kilcommon Parish, and the assistance went to communities a little further away from the from direct access to water. But most communities were those that had direct access to water because they had to get to the sailing vessels at anchor in Blacksod Bay, and many of them came out in carracks and smaller vessels, hookers, for example. A third each, almost a third each, came from the 2 parishes, civil parishes in the Belmullet district, the Kilmore parish and the Kilcommon parish, sorry. About 15% include people that we couldn't identify their townland of origin, and the rest came from Achill, 17%, and the smaller group from neighboring Burrishoole parish at 8%. The townlands, a good portion of the townlands from the 1883 sailings were identified in the Tuke report. I think that Rosemarie has done additional research and added townlands for others on the Blacksod Bay website, and our research uncovered probable townlands of origins for others. So we found departures identified from 94 townlands in those 4 civil parishes. Most of those townlands only had 1 or 2 families leaving, but departure numbers are related to family size. So that could include a family size of 12, 10 children and 2 parents on occasion, leaving from an individual village. But when we stack up the townlands that had 5 families or more leave, there were 9 townlands, and it really has struck us that some of the townlands were really emptied out. Some individual townlands, especially Tala in the Kilmore parish, the Valley in the Achill parish, Dula, Kilcommon, also Agaglashin or Tip in the Kilmore parish. 86 people from 17 families left from Tala. Just imagine that number of people leaving over a 2-year period would really empty out a small village. Some of the passenger manifests asked the passengers for their intended destination, but others, but some didn't supply the information, or some of the passenger manifests did not include that information. So when we're looking at confirmed destinations, those are destinations where we feel that we've actually found these people. And we found 3 groups returning to Ireland. That happened occasionally. One of our sailings landed in Quebec, and we found 6 family groups staying in Canada. But most were found in the United States, scattered across 21 states, mostly very rarely, if any, very few, if any, settled in states, mostly in northern states. And the indication that you get from the doing a searchable data search on the website for intended destinations kind of forefronted the importance of Pennsylvania and Ohio. And that is borne out by our research of confirmed destinations. Ohio and Pennsylvania have the lion's share of sailing parties by far. Ohio 23.5% and Pennsylvania 21%. The closest next states are Massachusetts and Wisconsin with 10 sailing parties each, which translates to only 3% of the total of sailing parties on those 6 ships. So Ohio and Pennsylvania are strong preferences among these people. And if you stack up counties instead of states, that prevalence is maintained. Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is located, is the top destination among all county destinations. And Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, with the large city of Scranton, is the next. And Schuylkill County in Pennsylvania, the next. And that's a coal mining region, doesn't have large towns, a lot of smaller coal mining towns. So I've kind of begun to mention coal mining here, and I won't go really in depth into Pennsylvania per se, but most of the Pennsylvania destinations are in 4 coal mining counties. And so it's clear that the prospect of coal mining drew people to those counties. What drew them to Cleveland, transitioning to Cleveland now? Cleveland had a more diversified economy already in the 1880s. Steel making was quite an engine for Cleveland's economy, but there were a lot of attendant or related industries, iron ore docks, railroad. It was a railroad center and a shipbuilding center. So there's plenty of opportunity for work here, particularly for unskilled laborers, manual laborers, requiring no particular education or skills, which was fortunate for this group of immigrants because they had neither education or skills. However, were some challenges that they might have met in the 1880s, which include there was a major year-long labor strike in one of the steel mills in 1882, and labor unrest in the steel mills lasted throughout the rest of the 1880s as well. This had a particular impact on the distribution of settlement in Cleveland, which I'll explain in a minute. But first, I want to point out that another reason for Tuke immigrants to come to Cleveland was more personal. Some of them probably had relatives here already. There was an earlier wave of ACL immigration to Cleveland in the 1860s that was particular to bad weather and growing patterns specific to ACL. The immigrants who arrived in the 1860s and their friends and families that trailed behind them in the 1870s settled primarily in 2 neighborhoods in Cleveland. One was called the Angle, and St. Malachy Parish was its sort of founding or foundational institution. And the other neighborhood was Newburgh, with Holy Name Parish being the center of settlement there for most of the Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland. So 1860s and trailing immigration into the 1870s, those people were recent enough for the 1880s immigrants to have a sense of connection with either family or friends, neighbors, fellow townland folk, and that helped bring some of the Tuke immigrants to Cleveland as well. Given the earlier fairly even settlement between the Angle and Newburgh in Cleveland, you might expect that the same thing would happen with the Tuke immigrants. However, it doesn't. The settlement to Newburgh is far less than the settlement in the Angle. We have tracked addresses and street names in the 1900 census in Cleveland. And this is kind of a rough picture because you don't find every single person in the census. Some can be found in other records in other ways, but we just chose to look at the street names in the census. Some people died before 1900, so it's not a super precise kind of picture, but it does give a rough idea. We're imposing small numbers on a 1898 ward map of Cleveland that sort of corresponds to the 1900 census. And we find that only 29 of the addresses can be tied to the ward that includes Newburgh and the steel mills, whereas far more can be found up in the neighborhood called Angle. The Angle is split into 2 wards at the time of 1900, yielding about 130 people, but earlier St. Malachy Parish encompassed all of the people living around on the river, whose crooked path is right here. This is the Cuyahoga River, and it's the native word meaning crooked river. So all the people living along this river near the top of the river belong to St. Malachy's Parish. So if you add the people in this ward in, you've got almost 150 people who settled originally in St. Malachy's Parish. And you also see not only that dense settlement close to the river and in the wards closest to the river, but you also get by 1900 the beginning of movement out from those central or original neighborhoods along main arteries, and particularly along the lakefront. You get another 36 people living in the ward next over from the southern part of the Angle neighborhood. So many more of the immigrants are settling in the Angle neighborhood and adjacent neighborhoods rather than in Newburgh. And I believe, but cannot prove, that it's related to that labor unrest in the steel mills, which the steel mill owners blamed on the Irish workers and therefore were reluctant for a time to hire Irish workers and in fact shut them out, locked them out for quite a while in the 1880s. So I think that skewed people towards, or shifted people towards, the Angle, where they could find work in the iron ore docks, the railroad yards and shipbuilding yards. It's not surprising then that one of the primary documents that seems to refer to this influx of immigrants in the 1880s comes from St. Malachy Parish, the church that served the Angle neighborhood. It's a report delivered to the diocese in 1884 for the year 1883, and recall that the ships came in 1883 and 84. The pastor is trying to justify the fact that there is a large number of non-paying families in the parish that year, not contributing to the upkeep of the parish at all. And he explained, and I quote, "The number of poor immigrants that settled here last year was very great." This undoubtedly refers to the influx of Tuke immigrants in the Angle neighborhood in Cleveland. The topography of the Angle neighborhood in Cleveland is such that it starts on high ground but slopes towards the lake and the river. The gently sloping part of the Angle had previously been settled by the 1860s and 1870s settlers, so the only available place to settle was the steepest incline towards the lake, the area where there's area of steepest incline. There was a triangle of 3 streets that many of these incoming immigrants crowded into, with hastily slapped up housing of poor quality. So the terrain was steep, it was crowded, narrow lots, poor quality housing, and a highly industrial area. The nickname Triangle was shortened later to Angle. Although there was work there, it was uncertain employment because much of the employment, especially on the iron ore docks, was employment as day laborer. That meant that there was no guaranteed salary. Work was paid, work was contracted, if you will, not an actual contract, but a verbal contract on a daily basis. And you only got paid for the days that you worked. And recall that Cleveland has a long, harsh winter, or can, and there might not be any work at all during the winter months. So despite the fact that there was work, there was still a high level of poverty in this neighborhood. Many of the immigrants came with a low level of education already. So there's a lack of education and high mortality rates in this neighborhood. From about 1890 on, when some of the youngest Tuke passengers were sort of beginning to come of age, if you will, the neighborhood began to be associated in newspapers with brawling, drinking, and gang activities, negative imagery that we would later associate with today with the concept of a ghetto. And indeed, some of our Tuke immigrants did get involved in some of that gang activity. There was a family of that included sons Patrick and Michael Gorman. They also had some cousins who were on there, and they were on one of the Tuke sailings, the 1883 Austrian. They had some cousins on that sailing as well, who also became involved in the Triangle Gang when the family lived first in the Angle. They moved out to the neighborhood further west, and the two brothers became involved in something called the McCart Street Gang, and they engaged in petty theft for the most part, but had some run-ins with the law that led to time in the penitentiary. This is Michael Foxy Gorman's mugshot taken at the penitentiary. Michael was 12 years old when his family arrived on the SS Austrian in 1883. But most of the Tuke passengers were law-abiding citizens, and those crowded conditions in the Angle led to mutual dependence and community building. And you could often find Tuke families in close proximity with each other in the census records for the Angle neighborhood. In the 1910 census in Cleveland, you find 4 households that are listed in a row on the census sheet. They're living on Vermont Street in the Angle. And those 4 households each household includes individuals with connections with the 1884 Canadian sailing, including 9 passengers and numerous children born in the US to those families. Almost all the households were multi-generational. They included widowed mothers, unmarried adult children, and the husbands and children of married daughters. So the picture that emerges is often of people sort of sticking together and presumably mutually supporting and helping each other, though some scatter off in their own directions as well, of course. We start, as we do the research, we start uncovering how interconnected many of the passengers are. Sort of maybe a bewildering diagram here, but I tried to sort of map out how we looked at one particular family and began to find that you had children of the same parents, Owen Haney and Sibby Cooney, who lived in the valley in Ackle. And they had at least 6 children that we've identified so far on 3 different sailings. And those are the people in the black boxes here. These people did not come to the US on their own. Each of these people had a family with them. So we're expanding the number of people, always expanding exponentially the number of people who might be interconnected. And each of them had further connections with people on other sailings, frequently in-laws who also came on other sailings. I won't go into all the details, but those interconnected people on other sailings are in the green boxes. In the case of Margaret Haney English, one of her adult sons came on another sailing, Edward English, and he expanded that web of connections by marrying one of his fellow passengers, Ellen Madden, after he came to Cleveland. Now, all of these people and their families came to Cleveland, and most of them stayed here except for this small group of McManaman in-laws of Michael Haney, who came to Cleveland at first, but followed an older sibling to Nebraska. That older sibling had already been in Nebraska for about a decade, and many of them decided to try a farming life in Nebraska rather than brave the industrial landscape of Cleveland. But you can, this is just one family. There are many interconnections that we're discovering all the time. We've tracked the occupations of the passengers that we've been documenting. but in order to really do higher level analysis of their occupations, we need to sort of standardize those occupations, put them in some kind of standard form. Haven't done that for all of the passengers yet, but anecdotally, most of the Tuke passengers, particularly the older ones, will have taken laboring jobs when they come to to North America. And sometimes very younger family members who grow up and are really schooled in North America, or family members, younger children born in the US, might take on occupations such as clerk, a clerking occupation that require a little bit more education. It's not to say that the children on the Tuke sailing couldn't read or write. Many of them could, though many of their parents could not. But they sort of, as many incoming immigrants do, kind of funneled first into laboring jobs. We were looking at a picture of a Gannon family that came to Cleveland on the 1884 Canadian, a large family group already, with 2 additional children born in the US. The occupations included digging ditches for the gas company, serving as a fireman, working in the blast furnace in a steel mill, working on the railroad, an iron worker. And yet, despite those laboring occupations, they chose to gather in 1915 in a very refined and dignified way to take a studio portrait of themselves, to convey their aspirational aspirational qualities. And many of the photographs shared on the Blacksod Bay Emigration website have this same aspirational quality to them. In investigating these people, we found out a lot about what became of them here, and in particular, we found some who have made very notable contributions. Probably the most famous Tuke descendant is, or Tuke adjacent individual would be boxer Johnny Kilbane. His father actually did not come on the Tuke immigration scheme. He came from Achill Parish a few years before, probably as a result of the pressures of the Forgotten Famine, which began to take hold in 1879, and that's about when he came here. On the 1884 Canadian sailing were Johnny's grandmother, an uncle, and a group of cousins. The family lived in the Angle, went to St. Malachy's Parish. It's there where Johnny learned how to box. In 1912, he became world featherweight boxing championship and held the title for 10 years. Tuke descendants have made a variety of marks in Cleveland. We've got a family that's memorialized in the name of a prominent community center here, the May Dugan Center, a family very involved in founding the West Side Irish American Club and supporters of St. Coleman's Church, another important Irish parish in Cleveland. A Conway family who was very involved in building the city's first grocery store chain, the Fisher Brothers, and another family involved in a group called the Irish Civic Association and the organization of the St. Patrick's Day Parade. Their name is Lynch and distantly related to me. And we're finding new connections all the time. I just found a group of Corrigan passengers. There were three sailing parties within one sailing, and among their descendants, a multi-generation family of judges in Cleveland. So in looking at the families, we're tracking indicators for literacy, employment, economic improvement, social standing, marital status, but really sort of making observations about any of these topics takes a lot of work and effort. We've just begun that. We kind of are assembling the building blocks for that analysis. So a real analysis of the impact of the Tuke scheme would take a lot more work to look at that in detail. And we're also conscious of the fact that at the end of the day, the outcomes for the people who came to North America probably need to be compared to the outcomes of the people who stayed behind, because part of Tuke's intention was to enlarge the holdings, get people to leave, and give their land to family members and friends and neighbors, so that the holdings of those who stayed behind could be enlarged. So that's another whole large area of research that we haven't attempted yet. But each semester, the students that I work with do a PowerPoint presentation for the faculty at John Carroll, the history faculty, and take a stab at making some observations on such topics as literacy and employment, etc. For that sailing, for the group of people that they personally have researched. And one of our students, a JCU graduate, has gone on to do a master's degree at James Madison University, and she chose to do her master's thesis on the 1884 Canadian Tuke sailing. And an online exhibit is the format for her master's thesis. She's pictured here, Erin Kelly, and we're very proud of the work she's done to continue exploring some of these sailings in greater depth. So Erin's not the only student who has worked on this. There's a group, at least one a year, for all these 6 years. Their names are here. I won't name them all right now, as some of them have contributed additional work outside of their original internship to help populate those spreadsheets. There's been about 4 of them, and I especially want to thank them. We've also relied on information contributed to the Black Sod Bay Emigration website, and also people who have contributed family trees to Ancestry and Family Search, for example. And we try to capture and copy that information into the family finders documents, crediting those sources when we find them. They have often provided the crucial key to finding people that we wouldn't find without the information that they've already shared. We'd especially like to thank Rosemary Garrity, who did all the transcriptions of the original manifests and continues to research all of these passengers herself. And it's her passion for recovering information about those Tuke passengers and their stories that has been the starting point for our work in Cleveland, and will be the starting point for any future study for a long time, I think. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Hope provided you with a little insight into the impact of the Tuke immigration on Cleveland, but there's a lot more work to do. Thanks.
Hello, friends in Ireland. My name is Mike Connolly. I'm a retired professor of history from St. Joseph's College here in Maine, which is located in Standish, Maine, where I taught history and political science for 36 years. I thought I'd talk a little bit today about the Connemara connection to Portland, Maine, my hometown, where I'm still living. I live on the edge of Munjoy Hill, looking out over Portland Harbor, Casco Bay, and beyond that, I can just barely see the fringes of Feenish Island and Calafeenish. A bit about my own family. My grandfather and grandmother both emigrated from the Carna region just prior to the Tuke scheme. My grandfather was Coleman Connolly, and he hailed from Calafeenish. My grandmother was from the island of Muinish, just literally a crow's fly from Calafeenish across the bay on the other side of Carna. Her mother was Nora Lee. The family came down from Oughterard to live in Muinish when some of the family had died in Oughterard and they needed to consolidate the family. So the Lee family started that way in Weenish. That was Nora Lee. She married a Joyce, and after he died, she married, Joyce was William Joyce, and then after his death, she married Daniel Mulcairn. And eventually, and we only found this out relatively few years ago, that she herself emigrated together with Daniel to Portland to be with her daughter, my grandmother. And now they're all buried out at Calvary Cemetery, which is the Catholic burial ground here in Portland. And if you were to walk around the old Calvary Cemetery, 90 to 95% of the names that you would see would be not only Irish names, but good Galway and Connemara names. And if you didn't know where you were located or what sky you were under, you'd almost think that you were located perhaps in Rahun Cemetery. Or better yet, out in the cemetery adjacent to Weenish, on the edge of Weenish Strand. So those are my family connections. I was the first in my family to be able to return back to Galway, which I did in the winter of 1972-73. I was part of an academic exchange program from Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida. And my professor was a Waters, which I later discovered was a good Galway name as well, Oughterard. And he was working in Dublin to set up a school of journalism. My family obviously is not the only one with Galway roots and Connemara connections. I want to talk about one of them just briefly. One of the famous ones, that would be the family of John Ford, which was the Feeney family. Now the father of John Ford, John A. Feeney, John Augustine Feeney, came from Torgdug, which is just on the western edge of Spittal. And his mother, Barbara Curran, who often the family claimed came from the Éireann Islands, most likely came in fact from a little bit further west from there in the area that they called Bunnahound, but not the Bunnahound where T.G. Carher is located, but another one a little bit further to the east from there. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Feeney family that we know of, and this is from the research of Margaret Feeney Lacombe, a local genealogist who works very much with the Maine Irish Heritage Center. She discovered that the first of the Feeneys to come was Daniel Feeney, who emigrated around 1842 and lived with his large family in Gorham, just north of and west of Portland. There was also a very strong connection to St. Paul, Minnesota, which the Tuke scheme is very well aware of. And Margaret thinks that the first of the Feeney families to go to St. Paul was Daniel's nephew, Martin Feeney, who probably arrived in St. Paul somewhere around 1850 to 1870 rather to 72. So through that, we have quite a connection to the Feeneys in Portland and the Feeneys located still out in the St. Paul, Minnesota area. Margaret was in touch with Pat Richardson Vogel, who died around 2007, and she's looking to make other connections with the Feeney family. In my book, John Ford in Focus, we have a picture of a very large connection of the Feeney descendants who are living out there. So there's a lot of people who want to get in touch with Margaret Feeney Lacombe at the Maine Irish Heritage Center. Another connection between Ireland and Maine, not so much from Connemara, but an interesting connection, was that of Benedicta Maine, named after the second Bishop of Boston, Benedict Fenwick. And his idea was to repatriate people from Ireland in the earlier part of the 19th century, from the land of Ireland to the land of America. And they were able to buy a large tract of land in potato farming country in the north of Maine in the county called Aroostook. The town where they located, many of them, was named in his honor, Benedict Fenwick, the town of Benedicta. And at one point it was thought that they would be the center for a seminary there, but later that seminary chose to be located in Worcester, Massachusetts, the site of Holy Cross College. But that's a strong connection to the farming community of Portland and the farming community of Maine. Another connection was discovered and graphically detailed in a wonderful video by Deirdre Ní Cheannaile of Éireann, and the work is called The Vines of Inishmaan, which talk about the Concannon family who came from Inishmaan and came first to Portland and Augusta in Maine, and then eventually made their way all the way out to California, where the Concannon winery is located today and produces large quantities of fine wine. They started out with sacramental wine, even during the age of Prohibition, and then went on to become a very large winery in the Livermore region of just to the east of San Francisco. I also want to mention the work of Dr. Kenneth Nilsson. Ken died a few years ago, very much too young, and creating much sadness in Boston, in New York, where he was from, in Portland, in Nova Scotia, and in particular in Galway, where he studied and lived for several years. He polished his Irish language at the suggestion of Tomás de Valderrama in the mountains of Connemara in Derryrella Woma, where he lived with a woman, Mary Joyce, and her husband, and became very familiar with the dialect of Galway Irish, which, according to de Valderrama and Nilsson himself, was maybe one of the purest forms of Irish, not contaminated by visitors like myself and relatives and even people who were interested in keeping the language going. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Tuke scheme now, if I could. I'm very grateful to Catherine Jennings for sending me the wonderful booklet that they put together on Mr. Tuke's fund, with excellent short articles by some of the best scholars in Ireland, Gerard O'Toole from NUIG, especially Gerard Moran from University College in Maynooth, and other local scholars and scholars of renown as well. That work puts into focus the emigration in particular from Clifden, and focusing more narrowly on places such as Carna. In Catherine Jennings' section in that book, she mentions, and this is to quote her, the potential immigrants from the west of Ireland had a literary problem, as most spoke only Irish and very few could read. Now, this is not an attempt to put down the immigrants from this area. It's a statement of fact. And it's a statement borne out in an all too familiar way with most of the Irish relatives here in Portland, Maine, the vast majority of them who came from Connemara. The three sections in particular would have been Cusharaga from Spittle and Barna all the way out to Rossaville and even Rossmuck. Eris Anach, further out between Kilkerran and Carna, including Moiris, Letterard, Mace, Half Mace, and the places where my relatives came from, Muinish and Calavinish. And then a third area would be up a little bit further north, the area called Cornamona. where a few of the Irish came, and according to Ken Nilsson, spoke a slightly different dialect from those from the other regions. And Nilsson his ear was good enough that he could distinguish between all of those three places. And he loved doing interviews. I first met him at Harvard in Boston, where I was forced to take the Irish language, not forced against my will, but forced to take it at Harvard because of the fact that at that period of time, 1979, Boston College was yet to have an Irish language component to their Irish Studies program. They very quickly addressed that, but my wish always had been that Ken Nilsson could have been connected with that Irish Studies program at Boston College, but that was not to be. We lost him to Nova Scotia, where he continued to do great interviews with the Irish and also the Scotch Gaelic speakers of Nova Scotia and Cape Breton in particular. Every time he would visit his family back in New Jersey, he would stop halfway on his journey from Nova Scotia here in Portland, where we interviewed probably 26 of the existing native Irish speakers that were still living here in the early 1980s. And some of those interviews made their way into some of his writing on the subject. For example, he wrote in my book, focused on the Irish in Maine, titled "They Changed Their Sky," which comes from a longer title, "They Changed Their Sky, but Not the Soul, Those Who Cross Over the Ocean." So Ken Nilsson's work, They Changed Their Sky, talks about the Irish in a subject titled "A Language That the Strangers Do Not Know." Also earlier, he wrote a piece called "Thinking of Monday," which was in Éire, Ireland in the late 1970s. So you can check out his work on Portland. One of his greatest claims was that he believes that because of the source of immigration from Connemara, Coisharga, Éireann, that Portland, Maine arguably had the largest percentage per capita of Irish speakers in North America. And I'm sure that people down in parts of Boston, especially Norwood and places like that, might find reason to quibble with that, but certainly Ken Nilsson was very impressed with the percentage of Irish speakers here in Portland, and now those have been documented in his work and other work as well. So one thing that I'd like to do in connection with the Tuke scheme, and thanks to Gerard Moran for sending this on to me, I'd like to read two little snippets that make a connection between Portland and specific places in that region. The first one from a connection with Feenish Island, just off the coast, both of Calafeenish and Weenish. So someplace that I can see from all of my relatives' homes when I go over there. Now, this letter was sent from Portland, Maine in July of 1883, very short excerpt. "I ain't sorry for leaving Ireland, and if I got Feenish Island free forever, I would not go. There ain't a month, but we would have 20 pounds shilling." This, I think, speaks to the fact that many of the Irish who came did not go back. Maybe they didn't have the resources to go back, but maybe they were fearful of the conditions that they left, and on the other hand, happy with the conditions that they had in Portland and other places like St. Paul, Boston, and other places in between. One of the Irish longshoremen here once said, "If they built a bridge all the way back to Ireland, I would not go." And again, it was not for lack of nostalgia about Ireland. They certainly did have that. And it was a romantic form of nostalgia, but they were content where they were located here and happy for their economic condition. The second excerpt that I'd like to read from you is another letter from Portland the very next year, May of 1884. It's a bit longer, but I think you might find it interesting, so I'll read it. I have to inform you that I arrived safe and sound myself and family here in Portland on the 25th April 1884, after an 11-day voyage of pleasant weather. We had fair wind since we left Galway until we landed in Boston. None of us was sick either. I have a house, my own, fixed up very nice, and I'm very happy and comfortable in it. I'm not sorry for coming either, for this is a good country, although I don't know much about it yet. And there will be lots of work here this summer. It's going to start next week, where 800 men will be working all summer, and I will be going to work there. So will my son too. I expect I will be a rich man yet, in God, if God spares us our health. This is a very good place during winter for longshoremen, all working on the English steamers, but they are gone now until next winter. I'll break from the excerpt just to say that my grandfather Coleman started work almost the day after he arrived on longshore, and the longshore work was very steady here from November through April, when the St. Lawrence River was frozen and Canadian grain being shipped over to England and other parts of Europe came down by the Grand Trunk Railroad to Portland, where it was held in great terminals, granaries, until it could be loaded onto steamships and sent over across the Atlantic. So I'll continue to finish his excerpt from 1884. My dear Johnny, I want to let your mother know that her cousin, Mrs. T, not named, and family are quite well, and indeed she and her husband were my friends and surely done their best for me. I have seen all the friends here, and all came with me that day I left Minish, and you never saw a better wedding in your life as they made for me, and I am much obliged to them all. I will have more news in my next letter, for I don't know much about the country so far. I am very thankful to a friend. He was a good friend of mine too, and he is a decent, respectable young man here in this country and doing very well too. He is respected by a good many, and his parents would be proud of him if they could see him now. These are both upbeat letters from people, one from Feenish Island and one from neighboring Minish, people who have settled in Portland and are doing well. And I'm sure that not all had that same example of success, but I think the vast majority of them did. And I think in looking at the question of why they came to Maine, certainly chain migration was one of the factors. Once somebody came and did well and reported that there was work, either domestic work in the hotels or at the homes of the wealthy on the Western Promenade or Eastern Promenade here in Portland for the women, or work in construction or working on canals, or in particular longshore for the men. These letters were well received, and maybe a little bit of money from America helped to grease the wheels and make it possible for others to come, like the Feeneys, like the Connollys, like the Lees, the Joyces, and so many others. Another reason, as in the case of Benedicta, was that there was land in Maine, it was cheap, and farming would be possible for those few who wanted to follow up a life in Ireland on the land with a life in Maine. So I think I'd like to conclude with just a couple of cases of social mobility. I started with those letters from the Tuke scheme, and I'd like to talk about a couple of people, two from Portland here, and one that's very well known by all of you in Ireland from Boston. I'll start with former two-term governor Joseph Brennan. His mother was Catherine Mulkern from Calafinish. the same townland that my grandfather came from and that I've mentioned earlier. His father was from next door in Rushy-na-Mania, John Brennan, who became a longshoreman and worked alongside my grandfather, Coleman Connolly. The work gangs that they were in were groups of about 16 to 18 workers, and his work gang, along with Coleman's, no doubt was all done through the Irish language because they were all native Irish speakers. Joe Brennan still lives on Munjoy Hill, and I can see his home from where I'm sitting right now. He's a good friend, and he was a great governor. The other person, of course, that is very well known to all of you there is John Ford, who I've mentioned before, with connections to the area around Spittal and just to the west of Spittal. John Feeney was born in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, just to the south of Portland along the coast. His family quickly moved back to Portland, where they were much more familiar and where there was a Catholic church, St. Dominic's, named after the Dominican Charles French from Galway. And they felt much more at home, living first of all in the west end of Portland, St. Dominic's Parish, and then moving just one street from where I am now in the east end of Portland, Munjoy Hill, which is in the Cathedral Parish. He lived here all the years going to school, finished at Portland High School, the same school that I attended. And then shortly after graduating from high school, he joined his older brother, Francis Feeney, who by then had changed his last name to Ford, probably trying to assimilate a little bit in the Hollywood film industry. And his younger brother, John, followed suit and changed his name from John Martin Feeney to John Ford. He's the greatest film producer in terms of volume in American history. He's earned 6 Academy Awards for Best Director, 4 of them for feature films, something that's never been duplicated. And his Spittal and Galway connections are something to be proud of. So the last one that I will mention is one that is equally well known in Galway and all of Ireland, and that's the example of Marty Walsh, whose mother was from Rosmuck and whose father, surprise, surprise, came also from Calafinish. So a strong connection to my family, to Joe Brennan's family, and to so many others here in Portland. What he did as the 2-term governor of Boston is very well known and respected, and so much so that President Biden has just recently appointed him as Secretary of Labor. And with the pandemic still raging in America and parts of the world, his work is very demanding, as you all know. I have done 3 works or 4 works on Ireland. 3 of them are academic works, but my most recent is a novel which takes place in Portland at the turn of the century in 1900. The title is Murky Overhead, and it tells the story of a typical family. I've given them the name Folan, but the story and experiences come from the Folans and the Feeneys and the Connollys and the Gorhams and the Joyces and the Mulkerns and the Flahertys and so many others from Galway who lived in Portland at that time. So with the telephone ringing in the background, I think that that tells me that my time is perhaps up. So I'm happy to have shared this with you today. I'm happy to be asked to do this, and I'm looking forward to the program that's coming out on the Tuke Emigration scheme. So thank you for your time today, and Gora Míle Mágaibh.
Well, good afternoon or evening in Ireland. My name is Richard Rook. It's actually Richard Tucker Rook. Tucker is the name of my family back in Ireland, who emigrated in 1883. I am a Tuke Emigration Fund descendant. As Jane Kennedy is fond of saying, a proud Tuke Emigration Fund descendant. And I'd like to tell you a little bit today about what the Tucker family encountered when they came to the United States, came to the New World in 1883. I know we're on a time limit, So you might see me looking down at my watch occasionally, and I apologize for that, being Irish American, I can talk forever, and I certainly don't want to do that. And I want to thank everybody who was involved in putting this program together. And thank you for inviting me, and it's a real honor. As I said, my name is Richard Tucker Rook. I'm speaking to you today from Massachusetts. I'm actually speaking only a few miles from where the Tuckers wound up settling 130 years ago. I am the great-grandson of John Tucker and Catherine Murray from Tip in the Belmullet Peninsula. And they emigrated as part of the Tuke program in April of 1883, arriving in Boston in May of 1883. But they didn't stay in Boston. They had been promised work at a cotton mill in Grosvenor, Connecticut. They were textile workers and railroad workers, and I'll explain some of that. My Aunt Anna, my mother's sister, who was probably the only source of family information that I could believe, used to joke that we must be the only Irish American family that never produced a priest, a politician, or a policeman. The 3 Ps of Irish American assimilation. We did produce a lot of railroad workers and textile workers. Just about all of the Tucker family, male and female, all 13 of them that survived infancy, worked in the textile mills. And all of their children, the next generation, worked in the textile mills. So I want to give you some idea of what they experienced. This would be a big change for them. Back in Belmullet, obviously they were farmers, tenant farmers, and now here they are in New England working in mills with heavy equipment. Because John Tucker was a seasonal agricultural worker back in the old country, and therefore spoke fluent English, and 2 of his working age sons spoke fluent English, we wound up here instead of going to Canada, as many of the Tuke program participants did who didn't speak English. So they wound up at the Grosvenor mill. To put this into some context, Grosvenor is about 60 miles, 100 kilometers from Boston. Okay, all of this is happening within even though it's over several states, it's happening over a very small geographic radius. For a textile worker in 1883, the Grosvenor mills were about as good as it gets. This was a modern mill, very progressive family. They were Quakers, which is probably, as was Mr. Tuke. So that was probably the connection that resulted in my family coming here. But it was a state-of-the-art facility. It was well ventilated. The mill owners made sure that there was adequate housing, stores, the pay was good, everything was good. The luck of the Irish was with them. But unfortunately, it didn't last very long, because in 1885, the person who arranged all of this, a man named Lucius Briggs, had to retire from the mill operation for health reasons, and the successors who replaced him were not quite as enlightened as he, and many of the employees just left. In my case, they left to work at the silk mills in New Jersey. That was going from the best of the textile world to the lowest rung on the textile ladder. These were hellholes. These were sweatshops. These were awful working conditions. To put this into some historical context, 1883 was moving into just about the heyday of the American Industrial Revolution, at least in southern New England. And southern New England was becoming the textile capital of the world. Immigrant labor was responsible for it. They were coming in from Ireland, from Poland, from Italy, from everywhere. They were welcomed, they were appreciated, and things were pretty good. But it didn't last very long, because the cotton mills literally and figuratively went south. Okay, The cost of doing business was lower in the South. The rail lines were complete. And by, say, 1910, the textile industry, which employed half of the state of Rhode Island when my family was here, was pretty much dead. So they turned to railroad work, which I will get into a little bit later. So they had it pretty well when they came here. They went to the offal mills in New Jersey. They stayed there for 7 years, and then they wound up back very close to where I am right now in northern Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts. They paid a very heavy price for the work in the textile mills, as I'll get into. And the price they paid was with their health. As I said, these were very poorly ventilated. It was oppressive heat, awful working conditions. You were breathing toxins all day long. Almost nobody in the Tucker family lived past the age of 35. They all died of respiratory diseases, or in some cases, railway accidents. Every single cause of death for 30 years of a Tucker who lived past infancy was either respiratory disease or a railroad accident. And since their spouses were also textile workers, they weren't producing, and dying young, they weren't producing many children. So my family, every generation, the Tucker family in New England seemed to get smaller, not bigger, okay? At least one good thing came out of this, one thing that I'm very proud of. In about 1910, 1911, the labor movement really started taking hold in southern New England. Immigrant textile workers were getting sick of the working conditions. There was at least in the United States, famous strike known as the Bread and Roses strike in northern Massachusetts, where 25,000 immigrant workers just walked off the job to protest, trying to get better working conditions. They were beaten, they were jailed, they were fired, but the genie was out of the bottle, and the mills in which my family worked also picked up the ball and did sympathy strikes. So my great-grandfather's 3 oldest children all became heavily involved in the labor movement. They went to jail, they were beaten, they were fired, but it produced some long-term federal legislation that improved the working condition of the immigrants, especially in Rhode Island, especially textile workers. Now, I know that many of the Tuke Fund immigrants had hard lives. Many of them went to the coal mines in Pennsylvania, the steel mills. They had to endure Montana and Minnesota winters if they were ranchers. But the textile workers, I think, suffered greatly and died young as a result of what they did. So my family gradually moved from textile work into the railroad work, not laying track, because the track had already been laid, but they worked as conductors, as brakemen, as station masters, the whole thing. So that's what we did. We were textile workers and labor workers. But there was one other thing that they did that I'm also very proud of. Around this time, and this surprised me greatly when I learned about it, the Irish Americans were not in southern New England, were not discriminated against in 1883. They were welcomed. They were the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. But as the Industrial Revolution here wore down and the mills were struggling because they were moving south, and the mill owners had made a lot of money and didn't really need or appreciate the immigrant labor as much as they did, there was a resurgence of anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant discrimination. There's no other way to say it. So again, it was John Tucker and his 3 children. They became very, very involved in the cause of Irish independence. From 1916 until 1922, they were raising money and doing whatever they could to support what was going on in Ireland. And this was partly, I think, as a result of the nativist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant sentiment that was taking over between 1910 and 1925. The Ku Klux Klan was shockingly powerful in Massachusetts and Rhode Island during that time period. They elected governors, they elected town officials, town leaders, and they were virulently anti-Catholic, anti a lot of things, but anti-Catholic. And so what happened is the Irish Americans started to think of themselves more in terms of their Irish heritage, and they became more supportive of what was going on in Ireland. One of my great uncles, John Tucker's son, raised a lot. He owned a bar, which is a good venue to raise money and in Rhode Island make political connections. He raised a lot of money and met when Eamon de Valera came over to Rhode Island in 1919 to raise money for the Irish independence cause. My great uncle was there to meet him with a very large check. So I'm very proud that they stood for something. They got involved in the labor movement. They got involved in the fight for Irish independence. But it's surprising to me that this even happened. Being ignorant of history, I thought the days of no Irish need apply in New England ended somewhere around 1860. Actually, it was still going strong into 1920. And it was really terrible. And it was born in some degree from the awful conditions that the textile workers had. There's a story I tell. The first job that my 7-year-old grandfather had in a textile mill was called a ratter. He was a ratter, okay? And what that meant was this was a mill that rats got caught in the looms. They got caught in the industrial process. The job of the ratter was to reach in and pull the rat out of the loom. Now, they didn't stop the loom because that would lose precious production time. They slowed it down, okay? So the 7-year-old kid had to reach in, grab a rat, which might not even be dead, okay? Pull it out, and if he guessed wrong, he was going to lose a hand because his hand would have been drawn right into the moving parts of the machine. So these were the conditions that textile workers had to put up with. And it didn't get a whole lot better. So I don't think it was a great loss that the textile industry moved south, but it certainly exacted a price in terms of health and early deaths. My own mother, this is when you realize that how close you are to anti-immigrant sentiment. My own mother had to drop out in 1920, had to drop out of school for 1 year, maybe 2 years, to help support her family because there was such a resurgence of anti-Irish sentiment and other ethnic groups. It wasn't just the Irish. There was such a resurgence of nativist sentiment that the working age males in her household couldn't get work. So she had to drop out of school to help support the family. So when I think this was all happening years and years ago, and it was, I also think that I'm one generation removed from no Irish need apply. My mother was affected by anti-Irish, anti-immigrant, anti-everything sentiment. So it makes me very, very grateful for the sacrifices they made. It makes me not complain so much when my car won't start in the morning because I think of what they had to go through so that I could even have a car. And I think when you look at the whole story in historical context, it's quite a remarkable story. And so we owe a great debt. I owe a great debt personally to the wonderful people that I have met since I discovered the story of the Tuke assisted emigration program. The relatives I didn't know I had, mostly in Ireland. The people, like the people who are putting this program together, who are keeping the story alive and making sure that we appreciate our heritage. But it certainly was not an easy heritage. And as I said, I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to tell the story. I hope my children and grandchildren will keep the story going. I'm trying to think of whether or not there's anything else that I wanted to add to this. I guess what I'm going to close by saying is that it was, I don't know, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I say, if they had to do it all over again, would they have come here? They were leaving terrible conditions in Ireland, but they were coming, at least my family, coming to terrible conditions in the United States. Now they persevered, and I'm glad for it, obviously, but it's a story, unfortunately, that seems to be repeating itself in the United States. The Irish have assimilated, other ethnic groups have assimilated, but now there's other groups coming into the country that are trying to come into the country that I think are feeling some of the same anti-immigrant sentiment that so many of us went through. So I'm grateful for what I have. I'm grateful for what I've experienced. And I'll close by saying thank you again to everybody who put this together. And I'm honored to be part of it. Thank you.
They arrived into Boston Harbor on the 4th of July, and my great-grandparents with 2 other families were ticketed to Warren, Rhode Island, where my great-grandfather got work in the local mill there. And they shared a house with the Monaghan family on the corner of Water Street, Bowen. But for some reason, they didn't settle, and they came back. And by April 1885, documents showed that they were back in Belmullet. My grandmother grew up, had 12 children, one of them my mother, and my mother in turn married, and I am one of 10 children. And in the way of things, the story has gone full circle, for our daughter married a US man, and they now live in America with our 2 grandchildren. And I'm going to finish with the poem Bone Road. Bone Road. If my great-grandparents had not made that journey back, some other mother would have been born, some other me. But they did, and now the pattern repeats itself, not sea but air, not hunger but heart, that calls our daughter to up sticks, follow the same whale way. This is no fairy story I will tell our grandchildren as they wave their spangled banners, carry lineage in their eyes, of a man, a woman, their 6 children, who, grateful for the passage paid, left behind the Bone Road, took the boat, grasped the hand of refuge, waiting for them on the other shore, and that in between time saw their leave-taking as the only way to find home.